Hey friend, come on in, get settled. Wherever you are sitting right now, I hope it is soft and warm and exactly where you want to be. If today was a heavy one or even just a long ordinary one, I am glad you found your way to this quiet corner of the internet tonight. Let us slow everything down together and let the rest of the world wait outside the door for a little while. Somewhere in the south of Portugal, inside a cave that stayed shut and dark for thousands of years, scientists just found something that should not exist anymore. Not a bone, not a tool, not even a fossil. They found sweat. They found saliva, left behind by a single human hand painting on cold stone more than 16,000 years before anyone ever built a pyramid. And somehow it survived. Tonight we're going to try to meet the person who left it there. But before we step inside that cave together, let us take care of one small comfortable thing first. If stories like this one bring you a little peace at the end of your day, the kindest thing you could do is tap that subscribe button, or leave a like, or drop a small comment on your way out, only if it truly feels right to you. And while you are there, tell me something. Where are you tonight? What time is it? Wherever you are curled up and listening to my voice. I love knowing where in the world you're joining me from, so leave a note if you feel like sharing one. Now let us set the mood properly. Turn the lights down low if you can. Maybe switch on a fan or crack a window open just enough for that soft, steady hum in the background. Get comfortable and get warm. Because where we are going tonight begins in complete darkness, sealed inside a quiet hillside in Portugal for a very long time. Let me take you to a small piece of land in the Alentejo region in the south of Portugal. Picture rolling sunburned plains that stretch on for what feels like forever. Cork oak trees standing wide and patient the way they have stood for generations. Sheep moving slowly across dry grass unbothered by the heat. A scatter of stone houses in a village so small that most maps barely give it a name, Santiago do Escoural. This is farming country. Quiet country. The kind of place where the biggest news of the week is usually the weather, or whose cattle wandered onto whose land overnight. Grandparents here still tell their grandchildren the same stories their own grandparents once told them, under the same wide sky beside the same old stone walls. Nothing here really changes very quickly, which is exactly what makes what happened next feel so strange even now, more than 60 years later. Now picture an ordinary afternoon in April in the year 1963. A crew of quarry workers is doing what quarry workers in this region had done for years, breaking into a low limestone hillside, splitting the rock apart piece by piece to be sold and used for building. This particular hillside had already been quarried for some time. Cartloads of stone had already left this same spot to become walls and floors and doorsteps in towns nobody in that crew would ever visit. Not one person digging into that hill that afternoon had any reason to think today would be any different from the dozens of ordinary work days that came before it. It is loud, dusty, unglamorous work. Somebody's calling out measurements. Somebody else is coughing from all the fine white dust hanging in the air. Nobody here is thinking about history today. They're thinking about the heat and the hour and whether there is any water left in the jug. Then somebody lights the charge. There is a pause, that strange half-second before an explosion, where the whole hillside almost seems to hold its breath. And then the blast. Dust and stone shoot into the warm afternoon air. Birds scatter out of nearby trees. The ground under everyone's boots trembles just slightly the way it always does. And when the dust finally begins to settle, and the ringing in everyone's ears starts to fade, one of the workers notices something strange. A crack in the rock face that should not be there. Not just a fracture, a gap. A hollow space where solid stone used to be only a moment ago. Now if you have ever cracked something open by accident, an old wall, A piece of furniture, even a stubborn walnut, you already know that small jolt of curiosity that follows right after. Well, this is that same feeling multiplied by about 50,000 years, though nobody standing there yet has any idea. Somebody grabs a light. We cannot know the exact detail of what kind of torch, a lantern, maybe just a match cupped carefully in two hands. But we do know what happened next because it has been passed down piece by piece for more than 60 years now. They lean toward the opening and they look inside. At first there's only blackness, thick and total, the kind of dark that seems to swallow a small beam of light instead of throwing it back. The air feels different, too cooler, and strangely still, as if it has not been disturbed by breath or moving air in longer than anyone could ever guess. They step through the gap, and they find themselves standing inside a chamber. Not enormous, not like the huge cathedral-sized caves you might picture from a film. This space feels narrow, almost private, with a low-curved ceiling and stone walls that seem to hum faintly with echo the moment a voice rises above a whisper. Somebody moves the light along the nearest wall, and that is when everything changes, because carved and painted into that stone faint but unmistakable are shapes. The curved back of a horse, the wide heavy shoulders of an animal that looks something like a bull but older, wilder. A creature most people standing in that quarry would only ever have seen in a museum drawing. Lines that seem to trace movement itself, a leg mid-stride, a head turned back over a shoulder, frozen there in stone for longer than anyone in the room could put into words. The colour is what catches most people first. A deep rusty red made from crushed earth and mineral, the kind of red that has survived because it was never really paint at all, not in the way we think of paint today, but something closer to the land itself, ground down and pressed onto stone by a human hand. Somebody reaches out almost without meaning to and touches the wall beside one of the animals. The stone is cool and slightly damp and worn smooth in places by centuries of dripping mineral water. It is such a small, ordinary gesture, a palm against a wall, and yet it means that in this exact moment 2 human hands have now touched this same patch of stone, separated by thousands and thousands of years, and neither one of them has any way of knowing anything about the other. For a moment nobody says anything at all. Maybe somebody laughs a little nervously the way people do when they're not quite sure what they are looking at. Maybe somebody jokes that they have just blasted their way into an old wine cellar and gotten themselves a strange bit of decoration for free. I like to imagine that happened because that is usually how we respond to something too big to take in right away. We make it small first with a little humour, just so it does not completely overwhelm us. But underneath the joke, I think some part of them already knew. There is something almost dizzying about being the very first person in 50,000 years to look at a picture that another human being once made with their own hand, thinking their own private thoughts on what was probably just an ordinary day in their own life too. We do not know her name or his name, whoever stood in this exact spot so long ago. We do not know if their hands were steady or shaking with cold or with something closer to reverence, but we know they were here. And for one long quiet moment in a hillside quarry in 1963, a small group of stunned workers were the only people alive who understood that. Word travels fast in a small village, and it did not take long for someone to mention what had turned up in that quarry to people who understood exactly what they were looking at. By 1963, the wider world already knew that caves like this could exist. Places like Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain had already stunned scientists decades earlier with their own painted animals frozen mid-motion on ancient stone walls. But nobody had ever found anything quite like it here in Portugal, not once, not in this entire country. Within that very same year, this quiet hillside near Santiago do Escoural was formally recognised and protected as a national monument. Archaeologists arrived. Careful hands replaced careless dynamite. And slowly, over the seasons and years that followed, specialists began to understand something remarkable, that this was not just any cave with pretty pictures on the walls. It was and still is the only cave in all of Portugal known to hold Paleolithic-era rock art, and one of the farthest western points in all of Europe where this kind of ancient painting has ever been found. But here is the part that took even longer to fully understand. This was not simply one moment frozen in stone. It was layers upon layers of human history stacked quietly on top of each other, in the dark like pages in a very old, very patient book. Long before any paintings were made here, other people had already sheltered inside these same walls, tens of thousands of years earlier, and they were not even the same species as the artists who came later. Picture a small fire glowing somewhere near this very entrance, long before it was an entrance at all, just an opening in the hillside, and figures gathered close around it, who looked at the world differently than we do, hunting the wild horses and heavy bulls that once roamed this land. This chapter alone stretches back roughly 50,000 years and belongs to a people we will meet properly very soon. Later, long after those first visitors had gone quiet forever, new people arrived and picked up pigment for the very first time, turning bare stone into something closer to memory. These were the painters, the artists, the ones whose horses and bulls that quarry crew found staring back at them in 1963. And later still, long after even the painters themselves had gone silent, other communities returned to this same cave for a completely different reason, one that had nothing to do with art at all, and everything to do with saying a final goodbye to their dead. Picture soft torchlight moving slowly through these same narrow passages, a small group of mourners carrying someone they loved, laying them gently to rest in a place their own ancestors had once considered sacred, though by then nobody quite remembered why. 3 separate chapters. 3 very different reasons for stepping into the dark, and every single one of them left something behind on these walls waiting. One small cave in the Portuguese countryside holding all of it at once, and it took a single unplanned explosion on an ordinary afternoon in 1963 to crack it open again, after it had stayed shut and forgotten for thousands and thousands of years. Today you can still visit this cave, though not quite the way those quarry workers first stumbled into it. Visitors need to book ahead, sometimes days in advance, and only small groups are allowed inside at any one time to protect the paintings that have already survived so much. Which feels fitting somehow. A place this fragile, this rare, deserves to be entered slowly and quietly, the way you might enter a room where somebody important is sleeping. And here is the part that still gives me a small chill every single time I think about it, and I promise we're only just getting started tonight. More than 60 years after that spring afternoon, long after those first quarry workers had grown old, or passed on completely, a new team of scientists returned to this exact cave carrying tools that nobody in 1963 could have dreamed of. Tools sensitive enough to search not for paintings, not for bones, not even for footprints, but for something far smaller, something left behind by a single breath or a single touch on that same stone wall thousands and thousands of years ago. And somehow, almost impossibly, they found it. But to understand exactly what they found, and why it may quietly change what we thought we knew about who these painters really were, we need to travel much further back than 1963. Further back than any blast or any quarry or any modern year at all. We need to go back to the very first people who ever set foot inside this cave, long before a single line of paint ever touched its walls. Picture this same valley now, but strip away everything you just saw. No painted horses, no quarry, no stone houses, no cork trees standing in neat, patient rows. Take away the village of Santiago do Escoural completely, because it will not exist for tens of thousands of years yet. What is left is colder, wilder, and far more silent than anything we know today. This is Europe during an ice age. Not the whole planet frozen solid the way a film might show it to you, but a colder, harsher version of the same land where winters bite harder and summers are shorter, and the animals roaming this stretch of the Alentejo look nothing like the sheep and cattle we pictured earlier. Wild horses move across open grassland in loose herds. Aurochs, the enormous ancestors of modern cattle, graze nearby easily, twice the size of any bull you would find in a farmyard today. Deer move quietly along the tree line, always listening, and somewhere among all of that life moving carefully between the horses and the aurochs and the deer is somebody who is not quite like us, not fully, and yet closer to us than almost anything else on this earth. We are talking about the Neanderthals. Take a second and picture the air itself, sharper, cleaner, colder against your face than anything you would feel stepping outside tonight. No engines anywhere, no electric light for thousands of miles in any direction. Just the crack of hooves on frozen ground somewhere out past the tree line and the low hush of a breeze moving over open grass. This was the everyday world these people woke up into every single morning for their entire lives. Now I want to pause here for a second because I think most of us grew up with a very particular picture in our heads of what a Neanderthal looked like. Hunched over, dragging their knuckles, grunting instead of speaking. Basically the punchline in 1,000 old cartoons. And I have to be honest with you, that picture is almost entirely wrong. And it is wrong for a reason I find fascinating, so stay with me for a moment before we step back into the cave. More than 100 years ago, scientists in a village in France dug up the skeleton of an older Neanderthal man buried in a shallow pit dug into the floor of a small cave. One of the leading researchers of that era studied his bones very carefully and confidently declared in paper after paper that Neanderthals walked bent forward, knees bowed, head jutting out in a slow, shuffling, ape-like posture. That single skeleton and one man's confident conclusion about it became the blueprint for how Neanderthals were drawn in museums, in textbooks, and in popular imagination for nearly a full century afterward. There was just one small problem. That particular individual had suffered from severe arthritis in his spine, his hip, and his jaw. He was by any measure an elderly man in serious pain, not a fair example of a healthy Neanderthal body at all. He was simply one unlucky aging man whose illness accidentally shaped an entire century of how the world pictured his entire species. It took decades, and quite a lot of stubborn scientists refusing to just take the old drawings at face value before anyone properly corrected the record. Doesn't that kind of blow your mind a little? One misunderstood arthritic skeleton, and millions of people spent generations picturing an entire branch of the human family as slouching brutes who could barely stand up straight. And here is the detail that almost nobody mentions in those old textbooks. That same elderly man had not simply died and been left where he fell. He had been placed into that pit deliberately, his body arranged with care, in a spot his own community chose and returned to. Somebody, or more likely several somebodies, took the time to bury him properly. You do not do that for a creature you considered disposable, because here is what we actually know now. Neanderthals stood upright just like us. Their brains were on average slightly larger than ours. They controlled fire. They made and repaired sophisticated stone tools. They treated wounds, and based on healed injuries found on many skeletons, they clearly cared for members of their group who were sick or hurt sometimes for years at a time. Somebody with a badly broken leg does not survive alone in an Ice Age landscape full of aurochs and wolves. Somebody has to bring them food. Somebody has to keep them warm. That is not brute instinct. That is compassion expressed in bone. Now back to our valley and back to this particular cave. Long before anyone touched pigment to these walls, small groups of Neanderthals used this hollow in the rock as a shelter. Not a permanent home in the way we might picture one, but a temporary base, a place to rest, to get out of the cold and the rough weather outside, to process the animals they'd hunted nearby before moving on again. The bones later found inside this cave tell part of that story quietly, without needing a single written word. Aurochs, deer, horse, the very same animals we just pictured moving across that Ice Age grassland, brought back here again and again across who knows how many generations by people simply trying to survive one more season. Picture the scene properly for a moment. A handful of figures crouched near the cave mouth, a fire crackling low against the stone, the smell of roasting meat drifting out into the cold evening air. Somebody sharpening a stone edge against another stone, the small, steady sound of it almost hypnotic. A child, if there was one among them, probably far more interested in the fire than in any of the work happening around it, the same way children have always been. I find something quietly moving about that. 50,000 years before any human being would think to paint a horse on this wall, other human beings of a different kind entirely were already gathering around a fire inside this exact same space, tired and cold, and probably arguing about something completely ordinary the way families always do. Whether we would recognize their language as language at all is something scientists still debate. But I do not think you need language to understand hunger or exhaustion, or the relief of finally getting out of the cold. Here is where the story gets even more interesting though, and this is the part that I think truly upends what most people assume. For a long time the story we told ourselves was simple. Homo sapiens, our own species, arrived in Europe, and we were the clever ones. We were the artists, the innovators, the ones who looked at a blank cave wall and saw a canvas. Neanderthals in this old version of the story were basically supporting characters, a slower, simpler species who eventually just faded away once the real innovators showed up. But a few hundred kilometers from this very cave, in a place called Cueva de los Aviones on the southeastern coast of Spain, archaeologists found something that quietly demolished that whole idea. Inside that cave they discovered seashells with tiny deliberate holes drilled through them, clearly meant to be strung and worn alongside lumps of red and yellow pigment that had been ground and mixed with real care. When scientists dated this material, the results were almost hard to believe. These objects are roughly 115,000 years old, and at that point in history Homo sapiens had not even reached that part of the world yet. The only people who could possibly have made them were Neanderthals. Think about that for a moment. Somebody tens of thousands of years before any modern human ever set foot in Iberia picked up a small ocean shell, thought it was beautiful enough to wear, drilled a careful hole through it, and then went looking for coloured earth to decorate themselves or their belongings. That is not survival instinct. That is vanity in the gentlest, most human sense of the word. That is somebody caring what they looked like. And it gets stranger still. In another cave in Spain called La Pasiega, there is a red ladder-shaped pattern painted directly onto the stone. Scientists used a very precise dating method on the thin mineral crust that had slowly formed over the paint, and the results showed this particular painting is at least 64,800 years old. Homo sapiens would not reach this part of Europe for tens of thousands of years after that paint had already dried, which means that somewhere in the deep, quiet dark of a Spanish cave, a Neanderthal hand may have been the very first hand in this entire region to ever press red pigment onto stone and leave something behind on purpose. So let me ask you something, since you are here with me tonight, and I would honestly love to know what you think. When you picture the very first artist in human history, who do you see in your mind? Because for most of the last century, almost nobody would have pictured a Neanderthal at all, and now it turns out we have to. I want to be careful here because I am not trying to hand you one single tidy conclusion and pretend the matter is fully settled. Scientists still argue over exactly how to interpret some of this evidence, whether every shell and every pigment stain proves what we hope it proves, And that kind of healthy disagreement is what good science is supposed to look like. But even with all that debate on the table, one thing feels harder and harder to deny with every passing year. Neanderthals were not a lesser failed draft of a human being, some rough sketch that evolution eventually threw away in favour of something better. They were their own complete, complicated thinking people, capable of a loss of care, of vanity, and quite possibly of art walking this same stretch of Portugal long before we ever did. Which brings us to something a little more personal, and this is where I think the story stops being about ancient bones in a museum drawer and starts being about you sitting right where you are, somewhere between about 40,000 and 50,000 years ago as Homo sapiens slowly spread further into Europe. Our species and the Neanderthals did not simply pass each other by like strangers on opposite sides of a valley. They met. They lived alongside one another for thousands of years in some regions, and at some point in ways we can only partly imagine they had children together. A Swedish scientist named Svante Pääbo spent decades of his life trying to answer a question that most of his own colleagues privately assumed was impossible. Whether it was even possible to reconstruct the genetic code preserved inside bones that were tens of thousands of years old, bones that had spent millennia soaking up bacteria, mold, and every trace of contamination the modern world could offer. It took him and his team years of failed attempts, ruined samples, and painstaking trial and error before the pieces finally started coming together. In 2010, his team finally succeeded in piecing together a working map of the Neanderthal genome, and in doing so they proved something extraordinary. Most people alive today whose ancestry traces back outside of Africa carry a small real piece of Neanderthal ancestry inside their own bodies, typically somewhere around 1 to 2% of their entire genetic makeup. That work was considered so important to our understanding of what it means to be human that it earned Pääbo one of the highest honours in all of science, a Nobel Prize awarded in 2022, which means that if that description fits you, there is a small quiet possibility that somewhere inside your own cells right now, while you're lying there listening to my voice, you're carrying an actual physical echo of somebody who once sat beside a fire in a cave very much like this one. Not a metaphor, not a nice turn of phrase, an actual fragment of them still here, still quietly doing its work inside you more than 40,000 years later, in your immune system, in your skin, in ways scientists are still working to fully understand. I don't know about you, but I find that almost impossible to fully sit with. It is one thing to learn about ancient people as a story that happened to somebody else somewhere far away and long ago. It is another thing entirely to realize that the story might be partly written inside your own body quietly, without you ever having asked for it or even known about it until a scientist somewhere decided to go looking. But their story, at least as its own separate branch of humanity, did not continue much longer after that. By around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations across Europe were shrinking, spreading thinner, and eventually disappearing altogether as a distinct people. Nobody knows the full reason why, and I want to be honest with you rather than pretend there is one clean answer, because there almost certainly is not. Some combination of a changing climate, shrinking numbers, competition for the same land, and the same herds of horses and aurochs, and slow absorption into the growing population of Homo sapiens around them likely all played some part. There does not seem to have been one single dramatic ending. It looks from everything we can tell much quieter and slower than that, more like a long, gradual fading than a sudden collapse. Some of the last known Neanderthal populations anywhere on the planet appear to have held on right here in the far south and west of the Iberian Peninsula, in the very same region where this cave sits today. This corner of the world warmer and gentler than much of Ice Age. Europe may have been one of the very last places on Earth where Neanderthals still gathered, still hunted, still sat around a fire together long after their cousins further north had already disappeared entirely, which means it is entirely possible, maybe even likely, that some of the final Neanderthals who ever breathed did so, not so far from this exact hillside, watching the same stars, hearing the same soft breeze drift through the same cork trees, with no way of knowing they were living through the last chapter of their entire species. There was no final battle, no single dramatic morning where everything ended. Just fewer footprints in the mud each passing year, fewer fires lit each winter, until one season somewhere the very last fire simply went out and nobody was left to notice. I think that deserves a moment of real quiet, honestly. Not sadness exactly, or at least not only sadness. Just respect for people who lived their entire lives, loved, buried their dead with care, and quietly vanished without ever once knowing that thousands of years later, somebody like you would still be thinking about them tonight in the dark with the fan humming softly somewhere nearby. Because not long after those last fires went out, somebody new was about to walk into this valley for the very first time. A different kind of human being, entirely carrying different tools, and eventually a very different relationship with the walls of this cave. They would not simply shelter here from the cold and move on. They would look at that same bare stone that the Neanderthals had walked past for thousands of years, and for reasons we are still trying to fully understand, they would decide to pick up a piece of coloured earth and press it against the rock and leave something behind on purpose, for reasons that go far beyond simple survival. And that is exactly where we are headed next. So who were they exactly? These new arrivals stepping into a valley that had already quietly said goodbye to its last Neanderthal families. We call them Cro-Magnons sometimes, though. That name really just points to a rock shelter in France, where their bones were first identified. In truth, they were Homo sapiens, the same species you and I belong to. Same brains, same bodies, same capacity for love and grief and boredom on a rainy afternoon. If you managed to dress one of them in modern clothes and sit them down at a coffee shop, you would probably just see another face in the crowd, maybe someone with strong opinions about how the espresso was made. They had been slowly spreading across Europe for thousands of years by this point, moving in small bands, following herds, following rivers, following whatever quiet instinct pulls a person toward the next hill instead of staying put. They carried better tools than the ones the Neanderthals had used, thinner blades, more specialized points, and they seemed to carry something else too, a habit of decorating almost everything they touched. Beads made from shell and bone, carved figurines, a restless, visible need to make ordinary objects a little more beautiful than they strictly needed to be. And at some point, one of these small groups wandered into this same stretch of the Alentejo, the same low hills, the same limestone hollow that Neanderthal families had once used as a shelter, generations upon generations earlier. I like to imagine that first moment of arrival, tired travellers ducking into a cave mouth to escape a sudden rain shower maybe, or simply looking for somewhere dry to spend the night, packs heavy on their backs, a baby fussing quietly against somebody's shoulder. They would not have known who had rested here before them. They could not have known. And yet here they were standing in the exact same hollow of stone, continuing a habit that stretched back further than either group could have possibly guessed. But something was different this time, something that would leave a mark on this cave far more lasting than any campfire or discarded bone ever could. At some point, someone in the new community looked at the bare, pale limestone wall in front of them, and instead of just seeing shelter, they saw something else. A surface. A place where an idea in their head might somehow travel outward and stay. Now I want you to really picture how this actually worked, because it is more involved than most people realize. This was not a quick doodle with a stick. Making these images took real preparation, real knowledge passed down carefully from one person to the next. They needed red. For that they crushed and ground pieces of ochre and iron-rich earth that turns a deep rust colour when broken open, sometimes heating it first to shift the shade toward a richer red. They needed black too, sometimes made from burnt wood charcoal, sometimes from a mineral called manganese dioxide ground down the same careful way. These powders were then mixed often with animal fat, sometimes with water, sometimes we now suspect with saliva, into something closer to a thick workable paste. Then came the actual application. Some marks were pressed on with a fingertip, direct and simple. Others were painted with a small bundle of fur or moss, acting almost like a crude brush. And for some of the most striking images found in caves across this part of the world, the pigment was placed in the mouth and blown through a hollow bone tube, spraying a fine even mist across the stone, sometimes around an outstretched hand, leaving behind a perfect stenciled outline. Somebody, tens of thousands of years ago, worked out an early form of an airbrush, using nothing but bone and breath. And all of this happened by firelight. Remember, flickering uneven shadows dancing across the stone in a way that would have made every painted horse look for just a moment almost like it was actually moving. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why go through all of that trouble? Gathering minerals, grinding them by hand, mixing binders, all just to mark a wall nobody outside your own small community would likely ever see. What would make that effort feel worthwhile to you if you were the one standing there with red paste on your fingers? At Escoural, this was not a single afternoon of inspiration. It was a tradition returned to again and again across an almost unbelievable stretch of time. The oldest layers of art on these walls reach back to the early Solutrean period, and the newest reach all the way into the final Magdalenian, a span that researchers estimate covers somewhere around 10,000 years of on and off use. 10,000 years. For comparison, that is nearly twice the distance between us and the construction of the first pyramids, which means the horses and bulls painted on these walls were not the work of one artist or even one generation. Dozens, maybe hundreds of generations came and went here, each one arriving to find a wall already marked by hands that had turned to dust long before they were even born, and each one choosing for reasons of their own to add something new beside it. Picture that for a second. A teenager walking into this same chamber with an older relative seeing a faded horse, painted by someone whose name had already been forgotten for centuries, and deciding quietly to press their own palm beside it, or to trace a new animal just a little further along the wall. Layer after layer, generation folding into generation, like a family photograph album nobody ever stopped adding pages to. The animals themselves tell their own story too if you know how to look closely enough. Horses appear again and again, drawn with a fluid, confident line that traces the curve of a neck or the bend of a foreleg in a way that clearly came from people who had spent their entire lives watching these creatures move. Heavy-bodied aurochs show up beside them, their horns rendered with real, deliberate care animals that were by every account enormous and truly dangerous to encounter, easily double the size of any cow grazing in a field today. And underneath many of the painted figures, if you look closely, there are older engraved lines scratched into the stone first, almost like a sketch before pigment was ever added on top. Some panels even show animals painted directly over older half-faded ones. Generations of artists working on the same crowded canvas without ever meeting each other, each one adding a new voice to a conversation that had already been going on for longer than they could probably imagine. Now here is something that always surprises people when I bring it up, and I think it deserves a proper spotlight of its own. Escoural was not some strange isolated exception sitting alone at the edge of the world. A few hundred kilometers to the north in a river valley that would remain completely unknown for thousands of years, an entire other gallery of Ice Age art was quietly waiting to be found, except this one was not hidden underground at all. In the early 1990s, engineers surveying land for a new dam along the Co River in the north of Portugal stumbled across strange markings carved directly into open rock faces along the riverbank. Thousands of them eventually. Horses, aurochs, ibex, deer, carved in the open air exposed to sun and rain for something like 20,000 years, technically illegal to exist by every rule we thought governed. How Ice Age people made their art, since almost everyone assumed this kind of imagery only survived deep inside protected caves. For a while it looked like all of it might vanish forever anyway, drowned under a reservoir for the sake of a hydroelectric project already underway. Archaeologists sounded the alarm. Local communities pushed back hard, refusing to accept that a project already years in the making and already millions of dollars deep could simply erase something that had survived every single winter for 20,000 years. It became a genuine national argument. Construction crews and engineers on one side, historians and ordinary citizens on the other, arguing over whether progress should ever be allowed to quietly bury the past without so much as a second thought. For once in a story like this, the ordinary citizens actually won. The dam project was cancelled. The valley was protected instead, and it now stands as one of the largest open-air collections of Ice Age art anywhere on our entire planet visited today by people who once nearly lost the chance to see it at all. I bring this up because I think it changes how you should picture this whole region. This was not one lonely cave with one lonely tradition of painting. This corner of Portugal, all along the western edge of a continent already sitting near the edge of the known world, was clearly alive with the same creative impulse indoors and outdoors, across many separate communities, all reaching for the exact same handful of animals, the exact same handful of colours, the exact same simple, stubborn urge to leave something behind. It makes you wonder how many more of these galleries are still waiting out there hidden under a hillside somewhere, or worn almost smooth by 20,000 years of rain, just waiting for the right person to look twice at an ordinary-looking rock. So let us finally sit with the big question, the one that has followed us through this entire story so far. Why did they actually do it? Honestly, we do not know for certain, and I think any storyteller who tells you otherwise with complete confidence is probably skipping over quite a lot of nuance to make things sound tidier than they really are. One of the earliest theories put forward by a French scholar in the early 1900s centered on the idea of hunting magic, the notion that painting a wounded or captured animal on a wall might somehow help secure a successful hunt in real life, a kind of visual prayer or ritual performed before heading out with a spear. It is a tidy idea, and it fits some of what we see. But it does not explain everything. Plenty of animals painted across these caves were rarely hunted at all, and plenty of animals that people relied on heavily for food barely appear on the walls at all. There is one more detail about all of this that I think gets overlooked far too often. Some of the pigments used in caves across this wider region were not simply picked up off the ground nearby. Certain minerals had to be sourced from outcrops many days of walking away, carried back deliberately over difficult terrain, purely for the purpose of eventually being ground into paint. That is not the behaviour of a species just barely scraping by. That is planning. That is somebody deciding well before they ever touched a wall that this particular shade of red mattered enough to be worth the long walk to go and get it. A newer theory leans towards something more spiritual. Some researchers argue that these caves' dark, echoing, sensory-deprived spaces may have been used for something closer to trance states or shamanic ritual journeys taken by specific individuals within a community who were believed to move between the world of the living and something beyond it, bringing back images from wherever their minds had travelled. Spend even 10 minutes deep inside a cave like this one, with every torch put out, and every voice silent, and you start to understand the appeal of that idea. Total darkness does strange, disorienting things to the human mind even now. It is not hard to imagine what it might have done to someone sitting alone in it for hours on purpose waiting for a vision. And still another theory, one I personally find quietly beautiful, suggests that some of the markings scattered among the animals' dots lines, strange little sequences repeated across different caves, and different centuries might have functioned almost like an early calendar, tracking the changing phases of the moon or the timing of seasonal migrations that an entire community's survival depended on. Imagine that for a second, an ordinary-looking row of dots beside a painted horse, actually being a working record of when the herds would return, understood instantly by everyone in that community, and completely invisible to us for tens of thousands of years, simply because we did not know how to look at it properly. Which theory do you find yourself leaning toward honestly prayer before the hunt, a doorway into trance and ritual, a working calendar written in dots and lines, or maybe just the oldest form of storytelling we will ever have proof of? I would not blame you for refusing to pick just one. Here's what I think, for whatever my opinion is worth to you tonight. I do not think we have to pick just one answer. 10,000 years is an enormous stretch of time for a single unchanging purpose to survive completely intact. It seems far more likely to me that this cave meant slightly different things to different generations who used it. Ritual to one group, memory to another. Maybe simple, unglamorous storytelling to a third parent sitting children down beside a fire and pointing at a horse on the wall, while explaining once again how their own grandparents used to hunt. And maybe for at least some of the people who ever stood here with red paste on their fingertips, it was something even simpler than any of that. Maybe it was just the same impulse that makes a person today carve initials into a park bench, or scratch a name into wet concrete before it dries, or stand in front of a beautiful view and feel a small stubborn need to somehow prove, if only to themselves, that they were here, that they existed, that this moment, ordinary as it might have felt at the time, mattered enough to leave something behind. I do not think that need has changed very much at all, honestly, in 50,000 years. We just carry different tools for it now. A phone instead of a hollow bone tube, a screen instead of a limestone wall. But underneath all of that, I think it is the exact same small, stubborn ache, the wish to be seen, to be remembered, to matter to somebody who comes after us even a little. But even a tradition this deeply rooted eventually goes quiet, and that is exactly what happened here, though not in the way you might expect. There was no fire, no flood, no dramatic ending written into the walls themselves. The paintings simply slowly stopped. New layers stopped appearing. The last hands to touch this stone with fresh pigment did their work, and then, as far as we can tell, nobody ever came back to add another line again. For a long stretch of time after that, this cave sat in near total silence, its horses and bulls fading gently in the dark, watched by no one at all. Dust settled undisturbed on ledges where fires had once burned nightly. Whatever last small community had called this place their own, eventually moved on, or simply faded the way every community eventually does, and the cave kept their pictures without asking for anything in return, the way stone always does, until many thousands of years later footsteps returned to this same chamber once more. Not painters this time, not hunters looking for shelter either. This next group came here carrying someone they loved, and they were not planning on leaving again so soon. Grief, it turns out, has its own kind of archaeology. By the time this next group of visitors made their way into the cave, the world outside had changed almost beyond recognition. The wild horses and heavy aurochs painted on these walls were still out there somewhere further off now, but the people arriving at this entrance were no longer purely hunters chasing after them. They were farmers, herders, people who had over countless generations slowly learned to plant grain in the ground and wait for it to grow to keep sheep and goats near at hand instead of tracking wild herds for days at a time. Some of this knowledge researchers now believe had travelled an extraordinarily long way to reach this corner of Portugal, carried slowly westward over many centuries by farming communities originally rooted far to the east along the shores of the Mediterranean, until it finally settled into these quiet Alentejo hills, mixing along the way with older local communities whose own ancestors had likely been hunting these same hillsides since long before any painting was ever added to this cave. It was one of the biggest shifts in the entire story of our species, and it changed almost everything about how people understood their place in the world, including, it turns out, how they treated their dead. Pottery started appearing for the first time simple at first, then increasingly decorated. Fields replaced open grassland. Permanent villages instead of temporary camps began dotting the landscape outside this cave, meaning that for the very first time a community might expect to still be living in roughly the same spot, 10, 20, even 50 years later, generation quietly building on top of generation in one fixed place, rather than following the herds wherever they wandered, because these newer arrivals were not looking for shelter from the rain, and they were not carrying pigment to mark a wall. They were carrying someone who had died wrapped carefully, brought here on purpose, deep into the dark to be laid to rest among people who had done the exact same thing before them. Picture it properly for a moment. A small procession moving carefully through the same narrow passages the painters once used torchlight, flickering across horses and bulls that had been fading on these walls for thousands of years. Already images this new group may not have fully understood, yet somehow still respected enough to walk quietly past. Someone at the front carrying a weight far heavier than its actual size, everyone behind them silent or speaking only in whispers, the way people still do in places that feel like they deserve it. Somewhere around 7,000 years ago, this cave, once a hunting shelter, once a painted sanctuary, quietly became something else entirely. A resting place for the dead. I want you to sit with that transformation for a second, because I think it says something remarkable about how differently these two groups related to the very same space. The painters who came before wanted their work seen, even if only by their own small community, returning again and again to add fresh colour beside the old. The people who came later wanted the opposite. They wanted somewhere hidden, somewhere dark and quiet and sealed away from rain and weather and wandering eyes, a place where their loved ones could simply be still undisturbed for as long as the stone itself might last. And it lasted. When archaeologists finally reached the deeper chambers of this cave decades after the accidental blast that reopened it, they found human remains representing more than 100 individuals. Not one grave, not two. An entire community's worth of the dead laid to rest across generations, 67 of them fully grown adults, 42 of them children who never reached that stage of life at all. That second number tends to stay with me longer than almost any other detail in this whole story. 42 children brought into this same darkness by people who loved them enough to carry them here, rather than simply leave them behind. Think about what that number actually represents for a moment. Not a single tragedy, but generation after generation of ordinary loss, the kind every farming community in the ancient world knew, intimately. Sickness, difficult births, hard winters, the slow accumulation of small griefs that never once made it into any history book, because there were no books yet to write them into. This cave is in its own quiet way one of the only history books that period ever left us. We still do versions of this today if you think about it. A cemetery visited every year on the same date. Flowers left quietly on a headstone nobody else will ever notice. A small box of belongings kept in a closet never used, never thrown away either. The instinct to gather our dead somewhere to return to that place, to mark it as different from every other patch of ground, seems to be something almost none of us ever fully outgrow, no matter how many thousands of years separate us from a farming family in the Alentejo. Here is something I find quietly fascinating about how we even know these numbers today. The bones in a cave used for burial across many generations rarely stay neatly organized the way a modern cemetery might make you expect each person resting undisturbed in their own marked plot. Floods happen. Later burials disturb earlier ones. New arrivals centuries apart sometimes ended up sharing the exact same small chamber, their remains gradually shifting, mixing and settling together into what researchers politely call a commingled assemblage, which is really just a careful clinical way of saying it becomes a genuine puzzle to work out who was even buried here in the first place, let alone how they were once related to one another. So scientists studying this cave turn to a method that has nothing to do with the ancient genetic material we've already talked about tonight. Instead, they looked at teeth, specifically at a protein found inside tooth enamel called a melogenin, which happens to come in a slightly different form depending on whether a person was born biologically male or female. That protein survives in a way raw genetic material sometimes does not, tucked safely inside the hardest substance the human body ever produces, waiting patiently for somebody with the right laboratory equipment to finally come looking for it. By carefully analyzing that protein in dozens of individual teeth recovered from this cave, researchers were able to reconstruct something like a demographic snapshot of who exactly this community was choosing to bury here, thousands of years after their bones had gone completely silent on the matter themselves, and what they found was not evenly balanced. The numbers leaned noticeably in one direction rather than the other, which raises a question I do not think anyone has fully answered yet. Was this cave reserved for certain families, certain lineages, certain roles within the community, rather than simply open to absolutely everyone who died nearby? We honestly do not know the full answer, but I find it fascinating that a single tooth sitting quietly in the dark for 7,000 years can still whisper something about the social rules of a community that otherwise left us no written record at all. They did not come here empty-handed either. Alongside the bones, archaeologists found a rich scatter of pottery, decorated with polished bands and carefully carved handles, the kind of careful, patient craftsmanship that takes real time to master, along with tools crafted from bone, thin awls likely used for working leather or basketry, and polished stone axes, some carved from a hard, dense volcanic rock, others from a paler stone called mica schist, each one smoothed and shaped by hand until the edges caught the torchlight properly. None of these materials occur naturally right at the cave entrance. Someone had to source them sometimes from outcrops a considerable distance away, shape them carefully over hours or days, and then choose to leave them here buried alongside people they cared about, rather than keeping such carefully made objects for daily use back home. Which makes me wonder, and I would love to know what you think about this too. Do you believe those objects were meant as gifts for whatever came after death, tools a person might need on some kind of onward journey? Or do you think they meant something a little more simple and human than that? Something closer to leaving a favourite object with somebody you have lost, not because they will use it, but because it feels unbearable to let it go along with them. Now here is where I think the story widens out in a way that truly changes how you should picture this entire region during this period. This cave was not the only remarkable thing happening in the Alentejo around this same stretch of time. Barely an hour's walk from where these burials were taking place, other communities were doing something almost unimaginably ambitious, and doing it with the exact same bare hands, the exact same simple tools, and nothing resembling a wheel, a pulley or a beast of burden trained to help. They were hauling enormous stone pillars, some standing taller than a grown adult, and weighing more than a small car across open countryside, and arranging them deliberately carefully into wide circular patterns on a gentle hillside near what is now the city of Evora. Stop and consider the sheer organisation that must have taken. Moving stones that size without metal tools, without animals, bred for heavy labour, means dozens of people working together in careful coordination, probably over many separate seasons, all agreeing on a shared plan, complicated enough that it required real leadership, real communication, and a level of long-term cooperation. We do not usually associate with communities this early in our story. We call the result the cromlech of the Almendra today. Nearly 100 standing stones, some carved with symbols, we still cannot fully explain tiny hooked shapes that look almost like a shepherd's staff, wavy lines that might represent water or rain, or something. We've simply lost the meaning of entirely arranged with clear attention to where the sun rises on the longest and shortest days of the year. Stand in the right spot during the summer solstice, and you can still watch the sun climb directly over one particular stone, exactly the way it has for thousands of years, exactly the way somebody planned for it to long before anyone had a word for astronomy. Construction on it began roughly 7,000 years ago as well, which means it is remarkably about 2,000 years older than the famous stone circle at Stonehenge in England, a fact that honestly surprises most people the first time they hear it. People tend to assume Stonehenge invented this whole idea when really it was already an old, well-established tradition by the time those particular stones in England went up. Not far from that same circle stands another structure entirely. A massive stone tomb known as the Great Dolmen of Zambujero, built to hold the dead of an entire community beneath a mound of earth and stone, its central chamber tall enough that you could stand upright inside it, more than 6,000 years after it was first built. So think about what that means. In the very same corner of Portugal, during the very same rough stretch of centuries, one community was quietly hiding their dead deep inside a hollow cave sealed away from daylight entirely, while another community not far off at all was doing almost the exact opposite building, something enormous visible from a distance aligned deliberately with the sun and the seasons practically shouting their presence into the landscape for anyone passing by to notice. Two completely different answers to the exact same question every human community eventually has to face. What do we do with our dead, and how do we want to be remembered? I do not think either answer is the correct one, honestly. I think they are simply two different, equally human ways of trying to hold on to something that keeps slipping away no matter how hard you grip it. Some families needed privacy and darkness, and quiet a place only their own people would ever know how to find again. Others needed permanence and scale and something the sun itself would notice every single year, whether anyone remembered their individual names or not. Which one feels closer to how you would want to be remembered if it were up to you? A quiet hidden place known only to those who loved you, or something enormous, lasting and impossible for the world to simply walk past without noticing? The burials at this cave did not happen all at once either. Based on the way researchers have been able to date the remains, this was a practice returned to across a long stretch of time generation, folding into generation the same way the painters once did, except this time the offering left behind was not a horse traced in red pigment, but a person laid gently into the dark surrounded by the people who had come before them. And then at some point that too came to an end. Nobody knows for certain whether the cave's entrance finally gave way on its own, worn down slowly by water and stone until it simply collapsed, or whether the last community to use this space made a deliberate choice to seal it, shut themselves, closing the door, so to speak, on a chapter they considered finished. Either way, the result was the same. The paintings went dark, the bones went quiet, and this entire hidden world, 3 separate chapters of human history layered one on top of another, disappeared completely from view. It would stay that way for thousands of years, forgotten so thoroughly that not even a single story or legend survived about what lay beneath that quiet Alentejo hillside. No shepherd passing overhead with their flock ever suspected what was resting just beneath their feet. No farmer ploughing a nearby field ever imagined the painted horses waiting patiently in the dark below. Until, of course, a very ordinary afternoon with a very ordinary explosion cracked it all back open again and handed an entirely new generation of people a set of questions that would take more than 60 years and tools nobody in that quarry could have possibly imagined to even begin answering properly. Because once the paintings were found again, once the bones were carefully studied and the pottery catalogued and the stone tools measured and sorted, one enormous question still sat there unanswered, staring back at every single archaeologist who ever stepped into this cave with a flashlight and a notebook, decade after decade, team after team, career after career. They could tell you what was painted. They could tell you roughly when. They could even eventually tell you something about who was buried here and how many and what they were laid to rest beside thanks to careful work with pottery and bone, and even the quiet chemistry hiding inside a single tooth. But there was one thing decades of careful, patient science still could not tell them, no matter how closely they studied the walls, no matter how many careful drawings and photographs and measurements they took. Who exactly had picked up that very first handful of red pigment all those thousands of years earlier and pressed it against the wall? For the better part of 6 decades, that exact question sat inside this cave completely unanswered, no matter how many careful, brilliant people tried their absolute best to answer it. And I want to be fair to those people, because it would be easy sitting here tonight with all the benefit of hindsight to make it sound like nobody was even trying. That is not accurate at all. Generations of scientists poured entire careers into this cave and caves just like it, spending whole, working lives crouched in cold, damp chambers with flashlights and notebooks, and along the way they built some truly remarkable tools. Tools that could tell you almost everything about this place. Except, frustratingly, the one thing everybody actually wanted to know. Let me walk you through what science actually could do, because I think it makes the eventual answer when it finally arrives later tonight land so much harder. This is not a short list either. Across roughly 6 decades, researchers from at least half a dozen different scientific fields all took their own turn, trying to crack open this exact mystery. Chemists, geologists, art historians, and eventually physical anthropologists too. And each one got a little closer, and each one eventually hit the exact same wall, quite literally in some cases, this very wall right in front of us. Start with something you've probably heard of before, even if only in passing. Radiocarbon dating. The basic idea is almost elegant in its simplicity. Every living thing on this planet absorbs a tiny, steady amount of a slightly unstable form of carbon while it is alive, and the moment it dies, that unstable carbon begins quietly breaking down at a fixed, predictable rate. Measure how much is left in a sample today, and you can calculate with real precision roughly how long ago that plant or animal stopped living. It is the same basic method that lets a museum confidently tell you a wooden artifact is exactly as old as they claim it is, and it has truly revolutionized how we understand the past. Here is the catch, though, and it is a catch that frustrated cave art researchers for the better part of a century. Radiocarbon dating only works on material that once contained carbon in the first place, meaning charcoal, bone, wood, anything organic. Most of the red pigment covering these walls is made from ground mineral iron, rich earth that never lived, never breathed, and so it never absorbed a single atom of the carbon. this entire method depends on. You cannot radiocarbon date a streak of red ochre any more than you could radiocarbon date a handful of dirt from your own back garden. Scientists were forced to date the campfires beside the paintings instead. Small flecks of leftover charcoal scraped carefully from the cave floor, and simply hope, often reasonably, that the fire and the painting on the wall above it belonged to roughly the same visit made by roughly the same hands. So researchers eventually turned to a second method, one that could actually touch the art itself. This one relies on something happening constantly, quietly above our heads in caves, just like this one, whether anyone is standing there to notice or not. Water seeps slowly through limestone, picking up trace amounts of uranium along the way, and as that water drips and evaporates on a cave wall, it leaves behind a thin, glassy mineral crust layer after layer, year after year, sometimes forming directly on top of existing paintings, sealing them in like a fly caught in amber. Uranium inside that crust is itself unstable, and it decays into a different element, thorium, at an extremely reliable, well-understood rate, ticking along steadily regardless of season, weather or century. Measure the ratio between the two inside a single thin layer of that crust, and you can calculate how long ago that particular layer formed. If the crust sits directly on top of a painting, then whatever is underneath it has to be at least that old, sometimes considerably older, since nobody can paint on a wall that has not been exposed yet. It is a beautiful piece of detective work, honestly. A method that turns something as unglamorous as dripping cave water into a kind of natural self-writing calendar. But notice what it actually tells you. An age. A minimum age at that, not even a precise one. Never a name. Never a face. Never so much as a hint of the person who once knelt in this exact spot with red paste on their fingertips. There is a third method too, one that relies far less on chemistry and far more on trained human eyes. Art historians and archaeologists spent decades comparing the style of animals painted across different caves, the particular curve of a horse's neck, the specific way a bull's horns were rendered, cataloguing thousands of these small artistic choices across hundreds of sites, slowly building something like a family tree of prehistoric artistic fashion. This approach can tell you with reasonable confidence that a particular horse probably belongs to roughly the same broad artistic tradition as horses painted somewhere else, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. What it absolutely cannot tell you is whether the same two hands were responsible for both, or 2,000 different hands separated by 100 generations, all quietly following the same inherited artistic habits, passed down the way any skill gets passed down parent to child, teacher to student. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment while we're on the subject. If you found two paintings today, both drawn in a strikingly similar style separated by an ocean and a century, would you assume the same artist made both? Of course, you would not. Style spreads. Style gets taught, copied, inherited sometimes badly, sometimes brilliantly by students who never once met the person who first invented it. Ancient art is no different, and every art historian working on these caves knew that limitation intimately, even while their catalogues of animal styles kept growing thicker and more impressive by the year. Now, out of everything scientists tried across these 6 frustrating, fascinating decades, one particular line of research came closer to touching an actual individual person than almost anything else, and I think it deserves real attention tonight because it is honestly one of my favourite stories in this entire field. In a cave in France called Rouffignac, researchers noticed something that had been sitting there largely overlooked for a very long time. Alongside the famous painted mammoths and horses, the walls and ceilings were also covered in strange squiggling lines, drawn not with pigment, but with bare fingers dragged carefully through a thin layer of soft, naturally forming clay coating parts of the stone. Rock art specialists call these finger flutings, and for years most researchers considered them a minor curiosity, nowhere near as important or as photogenic as the painted animals nearby, barely worth a footnote in most published studies. A husband and wife research team, Kevin Sharp and Leslie Van Gelder, disagreed and decided to take those squiggles far more seriously than anyone had before them. Beginning in the early 2000s, they spent years crouched in that same cave, carefully measuring the width of these lines down to the millimeter and comparing them against a modern reference set built from the actual finger measurements of living children and adults of every age. The results were remarkable. Many of the flutings in one particular chamber, they concluded, were made by extremely young children, some as young as 2 or 3 years old, standing or being held up against a cave wall, moving their small fingers through the clay, simply because it felt interesting under their fingertips, the same instinct that makes a toddler today drag a finger through fog on a car window or through wet sand at the edge of the ocean. They took it a full step further too, using the same finger-length ratio science that would later show up in other cave art research, the same basic difference in relative finger proportions between typical male and female hands. They were able to estimate with something like 80% accuracy whether a particular set of flutings likely belonged to a girl or a boy. And in a detail that still quietly moves me every time I think about it, careful measurement even allowed them to identify certain clusters of flutings that appeared to have been made by the exact same small hand returning to the same patch of wall more than once, perhaps years apart, perhaps within the same single afternoon. Sit with that for a second. An actual individual child in that exact spot more than once. Not a culture, not a broad tradition. One small person drawing her fingers through the same patch of soft clay on more than one separate occasion, thousands of years before anyone alive today was born. Researchers even suggested that a small handful of children, maybe 8 or 10 in total, seemed responsible for the vast majority of the flutings found throughout that chamber, which paints an oddly familiar picture if you think about it. A handful of restless kids left more or less to their own devices in a dim, echoing space, doing exactly what restless kids have always done with an empty wall, and nobody watching closely enough to stop them. This is as far as prehistoric art goes about as near as anyone had ever come to identifying a genuine individual rather than simply a category. Not male versus female in the abstract, not adult versus child as broad labels, but this particular small hand distinguishable from every other small hand that ever touched that same wall. For archaeology, that distinction matters enormously. A category tells you about a group. An individual tells you about a life. And there is one more detail from this same corner of research that I think belongs in tonight's story too. In another French cave called Gargas, not far from Rouffignac, there is a hand stencil on the wall that researchers believe shows something almost unbearably tender. A small, unmistakably young hand held gently in place by a larger, clearly adult hand, while pigment was blown carefully around both of them together, leaving one single stenciled shape that captures both hands at once, locked together in that exact position for tens of thousands of years. Somebody, an adult who loved that child, helped guide a small hand onto that wall on purpose and left behind proof of that single act of care preserved perfectly, long after every other detail of their relationship, their names, their voices, their faces disappeared completely. I do not think it is a stretch to call that one of the oldest surviving records of a parent teaching a child something with their own 2 hands. Does that change how you picture these places at all? It certainly changes it for me. Every time I think about that image, some cave wall stops feeling like an ancient archaeological puzzle and starts feeling like a nursery briefly tens of thousands of years ago, with someone kneeling down beside a small child, patiently the exact same way a parent might kneel down beside a child at a kitchen table tonight, helping small hands do something they could not quite manage entirely alone. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think good storytelling and good science share the exact same core value. And that value is simply telling the truth, even when a tidier version of events would sound better. Not every researcher in this field agrees completely with how those finger measurements were interpreted. Some later scientists have pushed back, questioning exactly how comparable a modern child's hand pressed flat against a photocopier really is to a Paleolithic child's finger dragging at an unknown angle through wet clay in near total darkness, arm outstretched, body twisted awkwardly toward a wall they could barely see. It is a fair criticism, and a healthy one. That kind of careful, sometimes uncomfortable disagreement is not a weakness in this story. It is exactly what real science is supposed to look like, a constant patient process of double-checking, questioning, and occasionally admitting that an earlier conclusion reached a little further than the evidence could actually support. Which brings us to the real point of everything I have just walked you through tonight, and I promise it connects directly to where this story is about to go. By the end of these 6 decades, science had done something truly extraordinary with this cave and hundreds of others like it. It could tell you the rough age of a painting, sometimes down to a specific century. It could group paintings into broad artistic families spanning entire regions. It could even, in the most remarkable cases, tell you the probable age and likely sex of a small child who once dragged their fingers through soft clay on a cave wall, and whether that same child had been back more than once. And still, after everything, after 6 full decades of increasingly clever detective work, spanning chemistry, art history, and careful physical measurement, there remained an enormous stubborn gap between all of that and one single individual human being, a specific person, a name we will never know attached to a face we will never see, standing in this exact cave at this exact spot, choosing to press their own hand, their own breath, their own actual body against this wall. Think about how strange that actually is when you sit with it for a moment. We can today sequence entire genomes belonging to creatures that went extinct millions of years before a single human being ever existed. We can send a small metal object into orbit around a planet tens of millions of miles away and have it phone home with photographs. We can decode the exact chemical fingerprint of a star that burned out long before our own planet even finished forming. And yet, for the longest time, one small cave wall in Portugal held a secret so intimate, so specific, that all of our cleverest instruments simply could not reach it. Not because the answer was not there. It was there the entire time, resting quietly on the stone patient in a way only stone can really be. We simply did not yet have a tool sensitive enough to hear it. Age, sex, rough style, and a probable century got us remarkably near. But near is not the same thing as actually meeting somebody. And for 60 years that particular gap seemed like the one thing science might simply never manage to bridge, no matter how many new tools got invented, no matter how patient or clever the next generation of researchers turned out to be. It would take an entirely different branch of science altogether, one that had nothing to do with measuring finger widths or counting mineral layers, one that most people, even most scientists working in this exact cave, would have called impossible only a few years earlier, to finally reach across that gap and almost impossibly touch something that had been waiting quietly in the dark since long before any of us were born. To understand how that gap finally got bridged, we need to leave this cave for a moment and travel somewhere much colder, much further east, to a mountain range most people could not point to on a map, and to a discovery that at first glance has nothing whatsoever to do with painted horses. In the year 2008, in a cave tucked into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a researcher digging carefully through a layer of ancient sediment pulled out a single tiny bone. Not a skull, not a jaw, a fragment of a pinky finger so small it could sit comfortably on a fingertip of your own, easy to overlook entirely if you were not looking closely, easy to mistake for a splinter of rock or a chip of old bone from any number of animals that had passed through that cave over the centuries. Nobody could tell much from it just by looking. It was too small, too plain, too anonymous. It did not even look particularly interesting sitting there in a small plastic tray, alongside dozens of other unremarkable fragments waiting to be catalogued. But scientists at a laboratory in Germany extracted genetic material from inside that tiny fragment anyway, more out of stubborn scientific habit than real expectation of finding anything special, and what came back from the analysis stunned the entire field of human evolution. That finger did not belong to a modern human. It did not belong to a Neanderthal either, even though Neanderthals were already known to have lived in that exact region. It belonged to something else entirely, a completely unknown branch of ancient humans that nobody had ever identified before in any bone in any museum anywhere on the planet. We call them the Denisovans, now named quietly after the cave where that single finger bone was found. And here is the detail that still catches me off guard every single time I think about it. We identified an entire lost branch of humanity, one that once stretched across a huge portion of Asia, based on later evidence purely from genetic material. Not from a skull we could study, not from a full skeleton we could measure and compare. From one small bone and the invisible code hiding quietly inside it. They left their own quiet mark on the present too, in a way that feels almost like an echo of what we already talked about with the Neanderthals earlier tonight, though this particular inheritance settled in a very different part of the world. Certain populations living today across parts of Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, and other communities scattered through the wider Pacific carry a noticeably larger share of Denisovan ancestry in their own genetic makeup than almost anyone else on the planet, in some cases several times higher than the small Neanderthal contribution most other people carry. An entire vanished people known to science through nothing more than one tiny finger bone, and yet still quietly present right now inside millions of living human beings who've likely never even heard the word Denisovan in their entire lives. Doesn't that completely change what you think a single bone fragment is even capable of telling us? I want to slow down for a moment and explain what that invisible code actually is, because I think it makes everything that comes later in tonight's storyland with so much more weight. Inside nearly every cell in your body sits an extraordinarily long molecule twisted into a familiar double spiral shape, carrying the complete biological instructions for building and running an entire human being. While a person is alive, their body works constantly to repair and maintain that molecule, keeping it whole and readable. The moment a person dies, that maintenance stops completely, and the molecule begins slowly, quietly falling apart, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments, chemically damaged piece by piece, year after year, century after century. Given enough time, what you're left with is not one long readable strand at all. It is millions of tiny broken fragments, some barely longer than a few dozen letters of genetic code scattered and mixed together with genetic material from bacteria, fungi, and whatever else, happen to be sharing that same patch of ground or stone over the centuries. Reading a modern genetic sample is roughly like reading a single intact book. Reading an ancient one is closer to being handed a book that has been through a paper shredder left in a damp basement for 10,000 years, and mixed together with several other shredded books at the same time, and being asked to somehow reconstruct the original story anyway, Would you even know where to begin if somebody handed you that shredded water-damaged pile and asked you to find one specific sentence hidden somewhere inside it? Because that more or less is exactly the task every single researcher in this field faces every single day. For a long stretch of scientific history, most researchers considered that task nearly impossible. Outside of exceptional circumstances, extremely well-preserved bones, frozen environments, ideal conditions that almost never actually occurred in the real world. Then, in the early 2000s, a Danish scientist named Eski Willerslev tried something that struck a lot of his colleagues as slightly unusual at the time, maybe even a little eccentric. Most serious genetic research back then still revolved almost entirely around bones, teeth, carefully preserved specimens locked away in museum drawers. Instead of searching for bones at all, he looked directly at frozen soil cores of ancient permafrost, pulled up from Siberia, and ordinary sediment collected from cave floors in temperate regions further south. And there, buried in what looked like plain dirt, he found genetic traces of mammoths, ancient horses, and nearly 20 different types of prehistoric plants, all of it surviving quietly in the ground itself with no bones required at all. It was a remarkable discovery and also a frustratingly incomplete one. Willerslev had no reliable way yet to tell the difference between truly ancient material and modern contamination that might have found its way into the same sample. Soil, it turns out, is everywhere, and so is modern genetic material floating in the air, resting on skin, drifting off every single person who has ever walked across a patch of ground, including inconveniently the very researchers doing the digging. Proving something old was actually there was one problem. Proving it had not simply been contaminated by something new, perhaps even by the archaeologist's own careless sneeze, was an entirely separate, much harder problem. It would take more than a decade of careful, patient refinement before that second problem finally got solved well enough to attempt something truly audacious. In a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, a geneticist named Matthias Meyer, along with a doctoral student on his team named Vivian Slon, decided to push this idea about as far as it could possibly go. If genetic material could survive in ordinary sediment, could it survive well enough, and in a pure enough state to actually identify which ancient human species had once occupied a cave even at sites where not a single bone had ever been recovered? They collected sediment samples from 7 separate cave sites scattered across Belgium, Croatia, France, Russia, and Spain, covering an almost dizzying span of time, some samples representing soil that had been sitting undisturbed for more than 500,000 years. When they finally sequenced everything back in the laboratory, the sheer scale of what they were looking at nearly overwhelmed them. A single sample, no bigger than a teaspoon of ordinary-looking dirt, contained something on the order of trillions of individual fragments of genetic material, the overwhelming majority of it belonging to bacteria, insects, plants, and every other form of life that had ever passed through that same patch of ground. Slon later described the moment the very first results came back as something bordering on disbelief, staring at a screen full of numbers that should not have been possible according to almost everything the field had assumed only a few years earlier. Somewhere inside that overwhelming flood of information, they needed to find an almost impossibly small number of fragments that once belonged to an actual ancient human being. To do it, they built something like a molecular fishing hook, a carefully designed genetic bait matched specifically to human genetic sequences, capable of latching onto the handful of relevant fragments hiding inside that enormous ocean of unrelated material and pulling them out for closer study. And remarkably it worked. They detected genuine Neanderthal genetic material in sediment from several of those cave sites. They found Denisovan genetic material too, in the very cave where that original tiny finger bone had first been discovered decades earlier. But here is the detail that I think matters most for where tonight's story is heading. At one particular cave in Belgium, a site called Truelwesse, researchers had never once found a Neanderthal bone, not a single one in decades of careful excavation. All they had were stone tools, the kind Neanderthals were known to make sitting in the layers of ancient sediment, with no direct proof anyone had actually connected those tools to an actual body. When Meyer and Sloan tested the dirt itself, Neanderthal genetic material turned up anyway, quietly proving that real physical people had once stood in that exact spot, even though every single trace of their actual bones had disappeared completely forever, sometime over the last tens of thousands of years. Sit with that for a second, because I think it deserves it. The bones were gone. Completely permanently gone, dissolved away by acidic soil, or scattered by scavenging animals, or simply lost to tens of thousands of years of geological churn. And still, the ground itself remembered who had been there, holding on to an invisible trace, long after every visible trace had vanished completely. It is almost as if the earth itself had been quietly keeping a diary the entire time, in a language nobody on the planet knew how to interpret until just a few years ago. A few years later, another team at that same laboratory pushed the technique even further, managing to extract a much richer, more complete form of genetic material, directly from sediment, the kind stored inside the nucleus of a cell, rather than scattered loosely throughout it. That distinction matters more than it might sound. The scattered genetic material researchers had been studying up to that point mostly came from a tiny structure inside each cell, passed down only through the mother's line, useful for tracing broad ancestry, but limited in how much detail it could actually reveal. Genetic material from the nucleus itself, by contrast, carries the entire genetic blueprint inherited from both parents, capable of revealing population movements, group relationships, and ancestry in a level of detail the earlier method could only hint at. Getting that richer material out of ordinary dirt rather than out of a carefully preserved bone felt to a lot of researchers in the field like unlocking an entire encyclopedia off a page that had already been left out in the rain for 100,000 years. What had started as a long-shot experiment in ordinary cave dirt had within less than a decade become one of the most powerful tools in the entire field of human origins research. Now I want to pause on something important here, something I think gets lost in a lot of the more breathless coverage of discoveries like these. None of this worked by accident, and none of it worked easily. Every single one of these breakthroughs depended on solving that exact contamination problem Millerslev had run into years earlier, distinguishing truly ancient material from anything modern that might have crept into a sample. Scientists solved it in part by learning to interpret the damage itself. Truly ancient genetic material breaks down in extremely specific, predictable chemical ways over long stretches of time, developing particular kinds of erosion and breakage at the very ends of each fragment, almost like a fingerprint of age itself, baked directly into the molecule. Modern contamination fresh off a researcher's own skin or breath simply does not show that same specific pattern of damage. By checking every single fragment for these tiny telltale signs of true antiquity, researchers built a reliable way to separate signal from noise, ancient whisper from modern static, even when the two are mixed together in the exact same pinch of dirt. It also meant working inside laboratories built almost like operating theatres, positive pressure rooms designed to keep outside air and outside skin cells from ever drifting in uninvited researchers dressed head to toe in protective suits, gloves changed constantly, every surface cleaned obsessively with chemicals strong enough to shred any stray modern genetic material into harmless, unreadable pieces before it could ever contaminate a sample. Even something as ordinary as a single cough, or a stray eyelash, or a fingertip brushed carelessly against the wrong surface could theoretically ruin months of careful patient work. The greatest threat to this entire field was never really the age of the sample. It was the person standing right there holding it, breathing over it no matter how carefully. So think about where that leaves us. By this point in the story, genetic material had been successfully pulled from ancient bones. It had been pulled from ordinary cave sediment even at sites with no bones at all. It had even been refined enough to reveal detailed ancestry, not just species identification. Bone to dirt to detailed history, each step considered nearly impossible right up until somebody proved it was not. And yet across every single one of those breakthroughs there remained one surface nobody had ever seriously attempted. Not bone, not sediment, not soil sitting quietly on a cave floor. The actual painted stone itself, the very wall a person might have touched or breathed on or knelt beside while working thousands and thousands of years ago. Think about why for a moment. A bone is dense, protected, sealed away from open air. Sediment buried under feet of soil is at least shielded from the worst of sunlight temperature swings and casual contact. A painted cave wall has none of those advantages. It sits exposed sometimes for tens of thousands of years, breathed on by every visitor, brushed against by every passing sleeve, touched by curious hands long before anyone understood what modern contamination even meant. If sediment felt like searching for a whisper in a hurricane, a rock art panel sounded to most experts like searching for that same whisper, after the hurricane had already been running for 50,000 years straight. For a long time, that idea barely counted as a real research question at all. It sounded to most people working in this field less like a legitimate experiment and more like wishful thinking, the kind of idea a person raises once at a conference dinner and everybody politely moves on from nodding politely quietly, certain it would never actually work. Which makes what happened next in this exact cave in the south of Portugal all the more remarkable. A team of researchers had been quietly preparing for this moment for years, long before anyone outside their own small circle ever heard the words Escoural Cave attached to anything happening in a modern laboratory. The project itself had a name, one of those slightly clunky scientific titles that sound more like a military operation than a research program built around the idea of finding the very first traces of human contact preserved directly on ancient rock art. Leading the archaeological side of the work was a Spanish researcher named Hipólito Collado Giraldo, someone who had spent decades of his career studying rock art across the Iberian Peninsula, walking into more painted caves than most of us will ever see photographs of in an entire lifetime, someone who had watched this exact idea get quietly dismissed at conference after conference for the better part of his career, and waiting back in Germany ready to attempt something that would have sounded like pure fantasy, only a few years earlier was the exact same laboratory. We just spent time with the exact same careful, methodical team that had already proven genetic material could survive in ordinary cave dirt with no bones anywhere nearby. This time they were not interested in dirt at all. They wanted the walls themselves. Over the course of this project, researchers collected samples from 24 separate rock art panels, spread across 11 different caves scattered through Spain and Portugal. An enormous, painstaking undertaking that meant travelling to some of the most remote, difficult-to-reach painted chambers in the entire Iberian Peninsula, carefully removing tiny fragments no larger than a grain of rice from surfaces that had in some cases not been touched by a human hand in tens of thousands of years. Some of these chambers required hours of careful crawling and climbing just to reach researchers working by headlamp, in spaces barely wide enough for a single person, hauling delicate equipment through passages that had never been designed with modern shoulders or modern backpacks in mind. taking every precaution imaginable not to damage a painting that had already survived longer than almost anything else humanity has ever created. Most of those samples, if we're being completely honest with each other tonight, gave the researchers nothing at all. That is simply how this kind of science works far more often than any exciting headline ever admits. Fragment after fragment came back empty or hopelessly contaminated or too degraded to say anything useful whatsoever. Out of dozens upon dozens of careful, expensive attempts spanning months of laboratory work and years of careful planning, before that only a small handful of samples ever produced anything resembling genuine ancient human genetic material. If you've ever spent months working towards something, only to watch attempt after attempt quietly fail, you already understand exactly the kind of patience this field demands from the people who choose to work in it, and one of those rare successes came from right here. Deep inside this cave sits a small, unremarkable-looking mark. Researchers have simply labelled Panel 11, a modest red dot pressed onto the stone. Thousands of years ago, the kind of detail a casual visitor might walk straight past, without a second glance, overshadowed by the more dramatic horses and bulls nearby. No dramatic composition, no sweeping gallery of animals, just a single quiet mark, the kind of thing you might miss entirely if your flashlight happened to drift half a second too fast across that particular stretch of wall. But at some point after that red dot was made, something remarkable happened to it completely by accident. Water-carrying dissolved minerals slowly dripped and seeped across that exact spot. The same natural process we already talked about earlier tonight, gradually building up a thin, glassy layer of calcite directly over top of the pigment, one microscopic layer at a time, year after year, for who knows how many centuries. Think about what that actually means for a moment. That thin mineral crust did not just help date the painting underneath it, it sealed it, locked it away from open air, from touch, from contamination, the way a layer of amber might seal a single trapped insect, preserving it in exactly the condition it was in, the moment the seal closed over it undisturbed for thousands of years afterward, waiting for nobody in particular, simply waiting. Researchers carefully removed a small fragment containing both the red pigment and the protective mineral crust above it, wrapped it with the kind of care usually reserved for museum artifacts worth a fortune, and sent it back to that same clean laboratory in Germany, the one with the positive pressure rooms and the researchers in full protective suits we already talked about. They're following exactly the kind of careful, obsessive protocol we walked through earlier. The sample was crushed into fine powder using a small bead mill submerged in a carefully balanced extraction solution, and the genetic material trapped inside it was slowly, patiently coaxed free from the mineral matrix that had been holding it prisoner for so long. What came back from that analysis is the reason we're all here together tonight. Inside that sample, researchers found genuine ancient human genetic material, not a trace of contamination from a careless modern visitor, not some later archaeologist's stray skin cell, actual ancient degraded genetic material showing exactly the kind of chemical damage pattern we discussed earlier, the specific wear that only builds up over an extraordinarily long stretch of time. But here is the detail that made this particular sample so much more than just another interesting data point. Alongside that human genetic material, researchers checked for something else entirely: genetic traces belonging to animals. Bats, rodents, any of the countless small creatures that typically leave their own genetic footprints scattered throughout cave sediment and cave walls over the centuries. In almost every comparable sample collected across this entire project, animal genetic material showed up right alongside the human material mixed together, which makes sense if you think about it, since sediment naturally carries traces from every creature that ever passed through, a space carried in on dust, tracked in on water, dragged along on paws and hooves and wings. In this particular sample from panel 11, there was none of that. No bats, no rodents, nothing at all except human genetic material sitting there completely alone, undiluted, unaccompanied, exactly the way you would expect it to look if a single living person and nobody else had once reached out and touched this precise spot. Let me explain why that single detail matters so enormously, because I think it is the actual heart of tonight's entire story. If this genetic material had simply washed in with dirt or drifted in with dust or arrived indirectly through some accident of water and sediment, you would expect it to look like practically every other sample collected during the same project, a messy mixture of human and animal traces all jumbled together the way debris naturally accumulates over centuries. Finding human genetic material completely alone with nothing else riding along beside it points towards something far more direct and far more personal. Not dirt that happened to drift past this spot. A hand, a cheek, a breath. Actual physical contact between a living person and this exact patch of stone. Try to picture the actual logic of it for a second, the way a detective might look at a scene and immediately understand what a single missing detail tells them. If sediment had carried this genetic material in from outside, it almost certainly would have carried plenty of other passengers along with it too. Insects, small mammals, birds nesting somewhere overhead. The fact that only one kind of visitor shows up in this particular sample, and no others, tells its own quiet story almost as clearly as a single unaccompanied footprint in fresh snow. Researchers considered every possibility they could think of. Sweat left behind by someone working near the wall for an extended stretch of time. Saliva perhaps from someone speaking or blowing pigment through a hollow tube the way we talked about earlier tonight, or simply resting their body against the stone to steady themselves while reaching for a higher section of the panel. They cannot tell us with complete certainty which one of those specific possibilities actually happened. What they can tell us with real confidence is that a real human body touched this exact spot directly, personally, leaving behind an invisible signature that would sit undisturbed for thousands of years, waiting for a laboratory that would not exist for almost the entire span of that waiting. I want to be honest with you about something else too, because I think it matters, and because I promised earlier tonight that this story would not pretend to know more than it actually does. Researchers cannot prove with absolute certainty that this particular trace belonged to the original artist who painted that red dot in the first place. It is entirely possible that somebody else visiting this cave at a completely different point in time, perhaps generations later, simply touched or breathed near that same spot before the calcite crust finally sealed it shut. Science done properly resists the temptation to hand you a tidier story than the evidence actually supports, even when the tidier version would make for a far more satisfying ending. Would it change how this story feels to you? Knowing that certainty, I'm not sure it would honestly, and here is why. Whether this particular trace belonged to the artist, or to someone who simply stood in that exact spot, at some later point admiring or resting or passing through it, still belong to a real person, standing exactly where we are picturing them standing inside this exact chamber. At some point during a stretch of human history, most of us will never fully wrap our heads around. But sit with what we do know for a moment, because even without a perfectly certain answer to that one remaining question, this still represents something that had never, not once in the entire history of this field, been successfully demonstrated before. A real physical trace of an actual human being preserved directly on painted rock art itself, not on a bone, not in ordinary dirt, but on the very wall a hand had once reached out and touched. Do you remember from earlier tonight just how impossible that idea sounded to most researchers only a few years ago? The kind of thing raised once at a conference dinner and quietly set aside, treated more like an interesting thought experiment than an actual research plan worth funding. It was not set aside forever, as it turns out. Somebody eventually decided the idea was worth testing properly, worth years of failed samples and careful refinement, worth risking a portion of an entire career on the possibility that everyone else might turn out to be wrong about what counted as impossible. The researcher leading this project later described the discovery in careful, measured terms, the kind scientists tend to use when they know they're standing on truly new ground and do not want to overstate what they have actually found, the kind of caution that takes real discipline after years of chasing a result like this one. She noted plainly that while they cannot directly connect this particular trace to the act of creating the artwork itself, this still stands as the very first solid evidence that human genetic material can survive on a cave wall across thousands of years. Her colleague, the archaeologist, who had spent decades walking through caves just like this one, put it even more, simply suggesting that this discovery was never really only about the paintings themselves. It was about understanding how people actually used these spaces and where specifically they left a piece of themselves behind. Coming from someone who had dedicated an entire career to this exact field, that particular way of framing it struck me as remarkably generous, choosing to talk about people and presence and daily life, rather than simply celebrating a technical achievement for its own sake. I keep coming back to that phrase, if I am honest with you, where they left a piece of themselves behind, because that is exactly what happened here, in this exact chamber, on this exact panel, at some point during a stretch of history so long that we still cannot pin it down to a single precise moment. What we can say is that the chemical damage inside that genetic material places it at a bare minimum several thousand years old, though researchers strongly suspect the true age reaches back much further than that, potentially all the way into the same distant era when these walls were first being painted at all tens of thousands of years ago. The honest answer, the one real scientists actually give instead of a neat, satisfying number, is that we may never know the exact year or even the exact century. What we do know is old enough that every single civilization you have ever studied in a history class, every pyramid, every empire, every written word ever recorded, happened entirely within the more recent, comfortable, well-documented sliver of time sitting on top of it. Take a moment and try to place yourself in that laboratory, the night the results finally came back. Picture the quiet hum of the equipment, a researcher scrolling through columns of data on a screen well past midnight, coffee gone cold hours earlier, tired eyes scanning line after line of numbers that mostly looked exactly like every other disappointing result from the weeks before, and then somewhere in all those numbers a signal nobody quite expected to actually find, not after so many failed samples before it. I imagine there was a long pause before anyone said a single word out loud, the kind of pause that happens right before somebody finally says out loud, "Wait, are you seeing this too?" Somewhere underneath all of that, quietly waiting inside a small red dot on a cave wall in Portugal, sat the actual physical echo of one single person, real specific, and until very recently completely unreachable. And now, for the first time in the entire history of this field, we finally have a way to start asking who exactly that person might have been. Let us actually open up that laboratory report properly now, because I think the details deserve more than a passing glance. And because I promised you real depth tonight, not just a headline skimmed off the top of a press release. This is where the actual substance of the discovery lives, tucked away in careful tables and cautious footnotes, and I think it is far more interesting than any single dramatic sentence could ever fully capture on its own. Across the entire project, that sweeping search through 24 rock art panels spread over 11 caves, researchers collected 54 separate samples in total. 54 careful, painstaking attempts to coax a whisper of genetic material out of stone that had been sitting exposed to open air for tens of thousands of years, each one requiring its own careful extraction, its own months of laboratory analysis, its own honest chance of simply amounting to nothing at all. Out of all 54, only 5 ever produced anything usable. 5 out of 54. Sit with that ratio for a moment, because I think it tells you almost everything you need to know about how rare and how truly difficult this entire achievement actually was. One of those 5, as we already know, came from the pigmented red dot on panel 11 right here in this cave. But it was not alone. 2 more of those 5 successful samples also came from this exact site, taken from bare, unpainted stretches of wall, deeper inside the cave system sections nobody had ever bothered decorating at all. The final 2 came from a completely different cave called Coveron, over the border in northern Spain, taken from plain rock surfaces sitting near painted panels there. Here is a detail I find quietly wonderful, and I think it deserves a moment of its own before we go any further. Researchers originally collected those unpainted wall samples purely as a scientific control, a kind of baseline comparison, meant to show what an ordinary, unremarkable patch of cave wall looked like genetically speaking, with no expectation of finding anything meaningful there at all. They were in the plainest sense the boring samples, the ones nobody expected to make it into any headline, collected mostly to make sure the exciting samples nearby actually meant something by comparison. And instead, those supposedly boring control samples turned out to hold some of the clearest, most convincing evidence in this entire study. Sometimes the most important discovery in an experiment is not the one you are actually looking for. I think there is a small lesson in that, honestly one that reaches well beyond any laboratory. How many things in your own life did you first approach as a formality, a box to check, only to have that exact thing turn out to matter more than whatever you originally thought you were there for? Now let me walk you through what the actual genetic material inside these 5 samples could and could not tell researchers, because there are really 2 separate types of evidence hiding inside a single ancient sample, and they do very different jobs, almost like 2 separate witnesses to the exact same event. One talkative but vague, willing to confirm the basics of what happened without ever getting into specifics, the other precise but painfully shy, holding the real detail but refusing to speak up unless conditions are exactly right. The first type lives inside a tiny structure found in every cell, passed down only through the mother's line generation after generation, largely unchanged for enormous stretches of time. It survives relatively well in degraded ancient material existing in far greater quantity inside each individual cell than the second type we're about to talk about, which makes it useful for confirming with real confidence that genetic material truly is human, truly is ancient, and roughly which broader population it might belong to. Think of it as a reliable, sturdy signal, easy to detect even in a badly damaged sample, but limited in exactly how much detailed personal information it can actually offer. It can tell you quite reliably that somebody was here. It struggles far more to tell you exactly who that somebody was. The second type is the far richer prize stored inside the nucleus of each cell, inherited from both parents, rather than just one carrying the complete genetic blueprint of an entire individual. This is the material capable of revealing biological sex, detailed ancestry, even physical traits like eye color or skin tone in the right circumstances. It is also unfortunately far more fragile, present in only a single copy per cell, rather than the many copies of the first type, and far more likely to have broken down into unusable fragments after thousands of years exposed on an open cave wall, which is exactly why finding any of it at all in any of these 5 samples counted as such a remarkable stroke of good fortune. Between these 2 types of evidence, researchers managed to piece together a picture of exactly who in the broadest biological sense had left these 5 traces behind. 3 of the 5 samples carried a genetic signature that pointed toward a woman. 1 pointed clearly toward a man, and 1 frustratingly simply did not preserve enough usable material to say either way with any real confidence, the genetic signal too faint, too degraded to responsibly draw a conclusion from a small permanent gap in the record that honest science simply has to leave open rather than fill in with a guess dressed up as a fact. Doesn't that already complicate a picture a lot of us probably walked in here with tonight without even realizing it? If I had asked you before this whole story began to picture a person touching a cave wall thousands of years ago, who did you imagine standing there? Close your eyes for half a second and actually check. A broad-shouldered hunter spear resting against the stone nearby. That is the image most of us inherited without ever really choosing it ourselves. Absorbed from old museum dioramas and older textbooks long before any of us had the tools to properly question it. I want to sit with that question a little longer, but not tonight, not in this exact part of our story. There is an entire thread waiting just ahead of us about who we have always assumed made this kind of art, and why and how badly some of those old assumptions deserve to be questioned, a conversation I promise we're going to have properly and full very soon. For right now, I simply want you to hold on to this one plain fact. Real women, and at least one real man, left an actual physical trace of themselves on these walls. Not a theory about gender. Not an assumption borrowed from old textbooks written by people who never once questioned their own starting point. An honest, if incomplete, genetic signature sitting quietly in the stone itself, waiting patiently to correct a picture most of us never even realized we were holding on to. Now here is a piece of this story that connects everything we have talked about tonight to a much wider map of European prehistory, and I think it deserves real attention too. The 2 samples from Kavaran, the ones originally collected as a boring control, turned out to carry enough well-preserved nuclear material for researchers to place them within a specific well-documented ancient population, one that geneticists refer to as the Western hunter-gatherers. This is not a vague or casual label. It describes a genuine, identifiable ancestral group whose genetic signature shows up again and again across skeletal remains found throughout Western and Central Europe from populations who lived across an enormous stretch of time, roughly between 16,700 and 5,200 years ago. These were the people who occupied much of the continent before farming ever arrived from the East hunters and gatherers in the truest sense, moving with the seasons, following herds, much like the ones we pictured earlier tonight, leaving their genetic fingerprints scattered across caves and burial sites from the Atlantic coast of Portugal all the way to the forests of Central Europe. Finding that same signature here in the walls of a cave in northern Spain quietly connects the people who once stood in these specific chambers to a much larger, much better understood family tree stretching across the entire continent. These were not some isolated, disconnected mystery population existing in a vacuum all their own. They were part of a genuine continent-spanning story, one small local thread woven into a much larger tapestry that researchers have been slowly reconstructing for decades, one ancient skeleton, one cave sample at a time. I find something almost comforting in that detail, honestly. These were never isolated, mysterious strangers disconnected from everything else we know about ancient Europe. They were part of the same broad human story archaeologists and geneticists have been piecing together for decades, just previously missing one particular chapter, the one written directly onto cave walls instead of into bones, I do want to be completely honest with you about one more thing though, because I think it earns real respect rather than a simple tidy summary. Even inside these 5 successful samples, the actual authentic ancient material never made up the whole picture. In the case of the Panel 11 sample specifically, researchers estimated that roughly half of everything they initially detected in that fragment was in fact modern contamination genetic material from researchers, visitors, or simply the passage of recent decades all mixed directly in with the truly ancient portion. Think about what that actually means for the people doing this work. They were not simply reading a clean, obvious signal, the kind you might picture from a television crime drama, a single dramatic readout confirming everything in an instant. They were carefully separating an authentic ancient whisper from a much louder layer of completely unrelated modern noise, relying on those specific chemical damage patterns we talked about earlier tonight. Patiently confirming fragment by fragment exactly which pieces of genetic code truly belong to the deep past and which pieces had crept in far more recently, perhaps from a researcher's own careful gloved hand decades ago, or a curious visitor's breath a century before that. That is not luck. That is an extraordinary amount of careful, disciplined, occasionally tedious scientific labour hiding quietly behind every single confident sentence in that published report. And even after all of that careful separation, one final piece of the puzzle still refuses to sit perfectly still, and I think it is worth addressing honestly before we move any further. How old exactly is this genetic material? The chemical damage inside the Panel 11 sample places a firm minimum age on it, several thousand years at the very least. But because this particular cave was sealed shut sometime during a much later period, and stayed that way right up until that quarry explosion, we spent our very first moments together discussing researchers can say with real confidence that whatever is preserved here has to be at least 4,000 to 5,000 years old, simply because nobody could have touched this wall after the entrance closed, sealing it off from any further human contact whatsoever. Nobody walked in here to leave a fresh mark after that door quietly shut behind the very last visitor. The true age, though, especially if this trace really does connect back to the original painters, rather than a later visitor, could reach much further, potentially all the way into the same distant era, when the paintings themselves were first created tens of thousands of years ago. Think of it a little like finding an old letter sealed inside a locked drawer that nobody has opened in 5,000 years. You know with total confidence that the letter is at least 5,000 years old, but the letter itself might have already been sitting in that drawer quietly aging for tens of thousands of years before the drawer was ever locked shut in the first place. The lock only tells you the most recent possible moment. It says nothing about how much earlier the story might actually begin. Meanwhile, that broader Western hunter-gatherer connection we just talked about tied to the Coveran samples specifically points toward a population that lived somewhere within a window stretching from around 16,700 years ago to roughly 5,200 years ago. 2 different lines of evidence, 2 different caves, 2 overlapping but not perfectly matching windows of time, each one narrowing the mystery a little further without ever quite closing it completely. I know that might feel a little unsatisfying if you were hoping for one single clean number to hold on to, but I would gently push back on that feeling if you will let me. A range like this is not a failure of the science. It is the science being honest with you, refusing to round a truly uncertain answer into something falsely tidy, just because tidy numbers feel better at the end of a long day. What we can say without any hesitation at all is this: real specific individual people, women, and at least one man connected by genetic thread to a known population that once moved across the whole of ancient Western Europe, touched this exact wall sometime across a window of history so vast that most of written human civilization would fit comfortably somewhere inside it. The wheel The pyramid, the printing press, the telephone resting in your own pocket, right now, all of it happened after the earliest possible edge of that window, and quite possibly all of it happened after the latest edge too. And that detail about who specifically we are beginning to picture here deserves so much more than a passing mention. Because for a very long time, almost nobody pictured it quite like this at all. Here is a strange thing about the history of archaeology, and I think it deserves to be said plainly without softening it too much. For the better part of a century, almost every serious study of prehistoric life started from one quiet, mostly unspoken assumption. Men did the hunting, men made the tools, men naturally made the art. Women in this old version of the story stayed somewhere in the background, tending fires, minding children present in the picture, but rarely holding the paintbrush, so to speak. Nobody ever really proved that assumption, if you go looking for where it actually came from. It simply settled into the field early on, absorbed by generations of researchers who grew up surrounded by their own era's rigid ideas about which sex did, which kind of work, and then carried straight into how they interpreted a completely different world, tens of thousands of years removed from their own. A museum diorama gets built once a plaster figure crouched over a fire, while another plaster figure grips a spear near the entrance, and copied 1,000 times afterward, each new copy borrowing its confidence from the one before it, until nobody quite remembers that the very first version was mostly just a guess made by one sculptor decades ago, working from nothing more solid than his own era's assumptions about family life. I want you to hold that thought for a moment, because it is about to run straight into a piece of research that quietly turned this entire picture upside down more than a decade ago now, using nothing more exotic than a measuring tape and a set of human hands. In the year 2013, an archaeologist named Dean Snow, working out of Pennsylvania State University, published a study that had been slowly taking shape in his mind for years, ever since he noticed something odd while flipping through a book of Paleolithic cave art photographs late one evening. One particular hand stencil printed on the page in front of him struck him immediately as female based purely on its proportions, though he could not yet explain exactly why he thought so. It was not a dramatic realization, no sudden flash of insight worth putting in a film. Just a quiet, nagging sense that something about the picture did not match what the caption underneath it confidently assumed. That small, nagging observation sent him toward the work of a British biologist named John Manning, who had spent years studying something surprisingly specific, the relative length of the second finger compared to the fourth finger on a human hand. Manning had found a genuine measurable pattern. In women, those two fingers tend to sit nearly the same length. In men, the fourth finger tends to run noticeably longer than the second. It is a small, almost invisible difference in daily life, the kind of thing you would never notice about your own hand unless somebody specifically pointed it out to you. Go ahead and glance down at your own hand for a second right now if you're curious. Most people have never once compared those two fingers in their entire lives. Snow wondered whether that same small measurable pattern might still be hiding inside the hand stencils scattered across European cave walls, pressed there by real hands tens of thousands of years ago. To test the idea properly, he first needed to calibrate his method against people alive today. He collected hand measurements from modern volunteers with European ancestry, built a working formula out of finger-length palm width, and that same second to fourth finger ratio, and then tested how well his formula could correctly guess the sex of a modern hand. It had never seen before, working through stack after stack of measurement sheets, refining the formula a little more with each pass. The results were honestly a little underwhelming at first glance, correct only around 60% of the time, barely better than a coin flip with a slight lean in the right direction. Snow himself later admitted that simply eyeballing a hand using nothing but instinct sometimes outperformed his own careful formula on the modern samples, a humbling thing for any scientist to have to write down in a published paper. Here is where the story takes a truly interesting turn, though one that took even Snow by surprise. When he applied that same imperfect formula to actual ancient hand stencils, the results were far clearer than the modern test had predicted. It turns out sexual dimorphism, the physical difference between typical male and female proportions, was measurably more pronounced in these ancient populations than in modern ones, where centuries of changing diet health and simple population mixing have blurred those old proportional differences considerably. The very imprecision that limited his modern test barely mattered once he turned his attention to hands from tens of thousands of years earlier. Working across 8 different painted caves in France and Spain, Snow eventually measured 32 hand stencils clearly preserved enough to analyse properly, 16 from a cave called El Castillo in Spain, 6 from a cave called Gargas in France, the very same cave we talked about earlier tonight, the one with that small hand held gently inside a larger one, and 5 more from a cave called Pêche Merle, also in France, home to its own famous gallery of spotted horses, surrounded by even more hand stencils scattered across the surrounding rock. The final count came out to 24 of those 32 hands, 75% of everything he measured pointing toward female hands. Only 8, roughly 1/4, appeared to belong to men. Sit with that number for a second, because I think it deserves more than a passing nod. 3 out of every 4 hand stencils Snow measured across these caves likely belonged to women at sites long assumed, without much real evidence behind the assumption, to represent almost exclusively male activity sites that had been confidently labelled and captioned and photographed for museum catalogues for the better part of a century before anyone thought to actually measure the hands themselves. Would that number have surprised you before tonight? I will be honest, it surprised me the first time I came across it too, and I have spent a fair amount of time thinking about ancient history. It is one thing to intellectually accept that old assumptions can be wrong. It is another thing entirely to sit with a specific number like 75% and feel how far off the old picture actually was. Now, I promised you earlier tonight that I would not hand you a tidier story than the evidence actually supports, and I meant that. Snow's work, striking as it is, has not gone unchallenged. A separate researcher, an evolutionary biologist named Dale Guthrie, conducted his own analysis of many of these same handprints a few years earlier, using a different set of measurements, focused more on palm width and thumb proportions, rather than finger-length ratios. Guthrie reached a strikingly different conclusion, suggesting that the majority of handprints actually belonged to adolescent boys. Teenagers he pictured as bored, restless, and drawn toward these caves the way teenagers have always been drawn toward places adults consider dangerous or forbidden. 2 careful, well-trained researchers working from broadly similar evidence arrived at strikingly different conclusions. That kind of disagreement is not a flaw in this story. It is simply what an honest, ongoing scientific debate actually looks like from the inside, long before any single answer gets treated as final. I think it is worth remembering that the next time a headline hands you one confident number, without mentioning that a real respected researcher somewhere else reached a different one. But here is the part of Snow's own reasoning that has stayed with me the longest, and I think it deserves real attention tonight. He pointed out plainly that the original assumption connecting cave art to male hunters was never really built on solid evidence in the first place. It grew at least in part out of the simple fact that most of the archaeologists doing this kind of interpretation across the 20th century happened to be men themselves working inside academic cultures with their own rigid, often unquestioned ideas about which sex did which kind of important work. A field built almost entirely by one perspective will tend to notice evidence that confirms what it already expects, and quietly overlook evidence that does not fit as neatly. I do not think that observation is really about cave art specifically, if I am honest with you. I think it applies to how any of us examine the past, or honestly, how any of us examine anything at all. We tend to find exactly what we already expected to find right up until somebody hands us a truly new tool and asks us to measure again more carefully this time. And this exact pattern assumption first correction, later courtesy of some new form of hard physical evidence, is not limited to painted caves at all. Let me take you somewhere completely different for a moment, because I think the comparison sharpens the point considerably. In 1878, archaeologists in Sweden uncovered a richly furnished Viking Age grave on an island called Birka, containing a sword, an axe, a spear armor piercing arrows, a battle knife, and the remains of 2 full-sized horses buried in a prominent chamber positioned right beside the town's garrison fort, overlooking the harbour below the kind of placement reserved only for somebody the community considered truly important. Every visible marker pointed toward an elite high-ranking warrior. For more than a century, this particular grave stood as a textbook example, quite literally reproduced in textbooks of a powerful male Viking warrior, laid to rest with the tools of his trade. Nobody seriously questioned that reading for well over 100 years, even as a handful of researchers along the way quietly noted that the skeleton itself looked on careful inspection somewhat slighter than expected. Then, in 2017, a team of Swedish researchers finally tested the actual genetic material preserved inside that skeleton. The result left no real room for argument. 2 X chromosomes, no Y chromosome anywhere in the sample. The celebrated Birka warrior had been a woman the entire time. The researcher leading that particular study later suggested plainly that earlier generations of scholars had simply assumed a warrior's grave meant a man's grave, and built an entire century of confident interpretation on top of an assumption nobody had actually tested. To be fair, that reassessment did not settle the matter completely either. Other respected historians pushed back, arguing that weapons placed in a grave do not automatically prove the person buried there personally used them in battle, that grave goods can carry symbolic or inherited meaning rather than a literal occupational resume. That pushback is worth taking seriously too. Good scholarship rarely ends the moment one exciting new headline appears. Do you see the shape this keeps taking across completely different centuries, completely different continents, completely unrelated fields of study? An assumption forms early, gets repeated confidently for generations, and eventually meets a piece of hard physical evidence, genetic material in both of these particular stories that forces everyone involved to sit back down and look again more carefully this time. Which brings us directly back to this cave and to the actual genetic findings we spent time with earlier tonight. I want to be careful here because I am not about to tell you that the traces found on this cave wall prove women painted these specific horses and bulls. That claim would go well beyond what the evidence actually supports, and I promised you honesty over neat conclusions tonight. What I can tell you is this. 3 of the 5 confirmed traces recovered from these walls carried a female genetic signature. That detail sits comfortably alongside everything Snow's handprint research already suggested a decade earlier, using an entirely different method on entirely different caves on the opposite side of these same mountains. 2 separate lines of evidence arriving from 2 completely different scientific directions, one built on careful finger measurements and modern reference data, the other built on molecules preserved inside a mineral crust, both quietly pointing toward the same uncomfortable overdue correction. Whoever spent time inside caves like this one, touching these walls, leaving something of themselves behind, was never as neatly exclusively male as most of the 20th century simply assumed without ever properly checking. I do not think the honest lesson here is to simply flip the old myth upside down and declare with equal overconfidence that prehistoric art was mostly women's work instead. That would just be trading one tidy oversimplified story for another equally tidy, equally oversimplified story, and I do not think either extreme actually honours the complexity of what these traces are telling us. I think the real lesson is smaller and quieter, and harder to turn into a punchy headline. We do not actually know nearly as much as previous generations of confident illustrators, museum curators and documentary narrators once assumed we did. And every time a new piece of physical evidence forces an honest correction like this one, it is worth remembering how many other confident old assumptions might still be sitting there quietly unexamined, simply waiting for somebody to finally think to measure again. Here is a question worth carrying with you past tonight honestly. What other confident old pictures in any field are we still quietly repeating, simply because nobody has yet built the right tool to check them properly? This cave, it turns out, was only one small piece of a much larger search. Because once this method proved it could actually work here, researchers immediately turned their attention to some of the most famous painted caves in the entire world, wondering whether this same invisible signature might be waiting quietly on walls far more famous than these. Let me tell you what happened when this same careful method finally reached the most famous painted cave on the entire planet, because I think the outcome surprised almost everyone involved, and not in the direction anybody was hoping for. But first, a quick word about Coveron, since I promised earlier tonight that we would return to it properly. Tucked into the hills of Asturias in the north of Spain, this cave sits within the same limestone-rich region that has produced some of the richest concentrations of Ice Age art anywhere in Europe, a landscape absolutely riddled with painted chambers, some famous, most known only to a small circle of specialists who have spent entire careers walking these same green rain-soaked hills. Coveron itself is not one of the household names of prehistoric art. It never drew the crowds or the headlines the way its more famous neighbours did. No gift shop, no paved parking lot, no line of tour buses waiting outside. And maybe that quiet obscurity is exactly why it worked so well for this particular project, undisturbed by decades of tourism, largely left alone by the kind of heavy modern handling that, as we're about to see, can quietly ruin an ancient sample before anyone even realizes the damage has been done. Now, about that famous neighbor, not far from Coveron, along that same stretch of northern Spanish coastline, sits a cave called Altamira, arguably the single most celebrated painted cave on this entire planet. Home to a ceiling covered in enormous richly shaded bison, painted with a level of shading and dimension that still stops visitors cold today. The story of how Altamira was even found is worth a moment of its own honestly, because it involves one of my favourite small details in the entire history of archaeology. In 1879, a landowner named Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola was exploring the cave, mostly searching the floor for stone tools and animal bones, the kind of thing archaeologists of that era typically looked for. Crouched low lantern held near the dirt, entirely focused on what might be buried beneath his own boots. His young daughter, a girl named Maria, somewhere around 8 years old at the time, wandered off a short distance with her own small lantern, more curious about the space itself than about digging through dirt the way children usually are. She looked up, and there, painted across the low ceiling directly above her, were the bison her father had spent months searching the ground for in plain sight the entire time, simply because nobody had thought to tilt their light upward. She called out to him, something to the effect of, "Look, Papa Oxen," and her father came running. I love that detail more than I can probably explain properly. The most important discovery in that entire cave came from a child looking somewhere nobody else had thought to look, purely out of ordinary curiosity, rather than any formal expertise at all. Isn't there something almost poetic about that, given everything we have already talked about tonight regarding who we assume gets to make history? Sadly, the story does not stay quite that charming for very long. When Sautuola presented these paintings to the wider academic community, most established experts of the era simply refused to believe him. The art looked too fresh, too vivid, too skillfully rendered to belong to what everyone confidently assumed were crude, unsophisticated Ice Age people, hardly capable in the thinking of the time of anything beyond simple flint tools. Sautuola was accused quite publicly of either being fooled by a hoax or perpetrating one himself with more than one prominent scholar, suggesting he had secretly hired a contemporary artist to fake the whole thing for attention. It would take more than 20 years and the discovery of similar art in caves across France that nobody could possibly accuse this one landowner of faking before the wider scientific community finally reluctantly admitted he had been right all along. Sautuola himself died in 1888, well before that vindication ever fully arrived, never once hearing the apology his own discovery deserved. Doesn't that sting a little even after all this time? A father brings back genuine world-changing proof and spends the rest of his life being quietly disbelieved by the exact community that should have celebrated him. Given everything we have talked about tonight, you can probably guess why researchers eventually turned their attention toward Altamira with real hope. If any cave on the planet held generations of artists returning again and again to the same walls, surely it would be this one, arguably the single richest concentration of Ice Age painting anywhere in the world. Among the objects tested was something wonderfully specific, an actual ancient bird bone airbrush, the very kind of hollow, blowing tube we talked about earlier tonight recovered from within Altamira itself, once used to spray pigment across that same ceiling by pressing it to the mouth and blowing over and over session after session, generation after generation. Think about the hope riding on that particular object for a moment. If any single item was ever going to carry a direct trace of saliva from an actual working artist, surely it would be a tool built specifically to be placed against somebody's lips over and over for as long as that painting session lasted, the closest thing to a direct kiss between a real person and the walls they were decorating. Researchers tested it carefully, hoping for exactly that kind of intimate personal trace. They found nothing usable at all. I want to sit with that result honestly rather than rushing past it, because I think it teaches us something just as valuable as any success story tonight. The reason had nothing to do with whether ancient saliva was ever actually present on that tool centuries ago. The reason was almost certainly the opposite problem: too much of the wrong kind of contact, far too recently. Altamira has been excavated, studied, handled, and examined by researchers for well over a century now, decades of that work happening long before anybody understood modern contamination, back when a bare hand and an ungloved touch were simply how careful archaeology got done. That same bone tool had likely passed through dozens of hands, breathed nearby. Dozens of researchers sat in dozens of collection drawers over the past 100+ years, each contact adding one more layer of recent genetic material directly on top of anything ancient that might once have survived. Here is the quietly painful irony sitting underneath this whole story, and I think it deserves real attention. The most famous cave, the most celebrated, the most thoroughly studied site in this entire field turned out to be one of the hardest possible places to find exactly the kind of evidence this project was searching for, precisely because of that fame. All that attention, all that careful scholarship across more than a century, all those well-meaning visits by researchers eager to learn everything they could, came with an invisible cost nobody could have anticipated back when it happened. A slow, cumulative layer of modern contamination settling over everything the original artist had left behind, one careful, curious touch at a time. Meanwhile, this cave, the one we have spent our entire time together in tonight, sat sealed away, forgotten, completely untouched by human hands for thousands of years, right up until the quarry blast in 1963. Nobody studied it obsessively for a century. Nobody handled its tools decade after decade before contamination science existed. Its very obscurity, the thing that once made it feel like a footnote compared to famous sites like Altamira, turned out to be exactly what protected it well enough for this discovery to finally happen at all. Isn't that a strange kind of justice? The quiet, overlooked cave outlasted the famous one, at least for this particular purpose. Being forgotten, it turns out, was not always the tragedy it seemed like at the time. I do want to be fair to Altamira before we move on, though, because this is not really the end of its story either. Researchers involved in this project have specifically named it a priority for future testing, precisely because of how many separate layers of painting it contains, representing potentially dozens of generations of different artists working across an enormous stretch of time. The bone tool failed. The walls themselves, in places nobody has yet sampled properly, remain an open question, protected corners of stone that a century of enthusiastic tourism and hands-on research somehow never quite reached. Science rarely closes a door completely. It usually just marks that particular door as harder to open than expected and moves on to try a different one nearby patiently, without giving up on the original hope entirely. Would you have guessed before tonight that being famous could actually work against a piece of history? Rather than for it, I certainly would not have, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment given how much we tend to assume that more attention automatically means more knowledge. Now let me pull the camera back even further for a moment, because I think this story deserves a truly global frame before we go any further tonight, not just a European one. On the other side of the entire planet, on an Indonesian island called Sulawesi, researchers have spent the last decade uncovering something that quietly rewrote assumptions almost as thoroughly as anything we have discussed tonight. Deep inside limestone caves scattered across a region called Maros Pangkep, painted images of a small warty wild pig. An animal still found on that same island today have been dated, using that same mineral crust technique we already walked through earlier, to a minimum age of around 45,500 years, currently regarded as among the oldest known figurative paintings anywhere on Earth. For decades, most scholars assumed this kind of confident, recognizable animal art belonged almost exclusively to Europe, a quiet, unspoken bias baked into an entire century of textbooks, written mostly by European and American researchers studying European and American caves. That particular pig quietly dismantled the assumption the same way our story tonight has dismantled several others. A hand stencil in a nearby cave carries a minimum age of nearly 40,000 years, roughly comparable to some of the earliest painted images found anywhere across Europe. Let that sit with you for a moment. On opposite sides of the entire planet separated by an ocean, a continent and every mountain range in between, with no possible contact between them whatsoever, completely unconnected groups of human beings were doing the exact same thing at roughly the same extraordinarily distant stretch of time, grinding pigment, pressing it onto stone, choosing independently without any shared culture or communication whatsoever that a cave wall was worth marking. Does that not tell you something about how deep this particular impulse actually runs in all of us? If two completely separate branches of humanity thousands of miles apart arrived at the same basic idea without ever once comparing notes. Just this year, in fact, a newer study out of that same region suggested an even older hand stencil one where the fingers appear deliberately extended into something closer to claws might reach back nearly 68,000 years, though the researchers involved are quick to note that dating results this early still carry real uncertainty and deserve careful scrutiny rather than immediate uncritical celebration. One of the scientists involved put it plainly, admitting the relationship between the dated mineral layer and the pigment underneath it still needs closer examination before anyone treats that number as settled fact. I mention that not to hand you a firm new number, but because I think it is worth knowing that this particular story is still actively being written right now, in real time on the opposite side of the world from this quiet cave in Portugal. Nobody has yet attempted the exact kind of genetic testing we spent tonight exploring on any of those Indonesian caves. Not because researchers lack interest, but simply because the same careful, expensive, painstaking process that succeeded here has not yet had the chance to make that particular journey across an entirely different ocean into an entirely different climate, with its own entirely different preservation challenges still waiting to be properly understood. Which means, if you think about it, that the story we've been telling you tonight is not really finished at all. It is closer to a first chapter, somewhere out there in caves most of us have never even heard the names of in Indonesia, in Africa, in corners of the world. Archaeologists have barely begun to properly search the exact same kind of invisible signature may be sitting quietly on stone, right now, waiting for the right team, the right sample, the right small stroke of good fortune, the way it waited here for more than 60 years before anyone finally came looking properly. I find something truly hopeful in that thought, if I am honest with you, rather than something merely academic. This was never really a single discovery contained neatly inside one cave in Portugal. It was the opening of an entirely new kind of question, one we are only just now learning how to properly ask, and one that will likely keep rewriting itself for decades after tonight, long after this particular video has ended, and you have moved on to whatever comes next in your own evening. And once you start asking a question like that, it tends to carry you somewhere far more personal than any single dig site or laboratory report ever could. Sweat and saliva sound like such small, almost embarrassing words to build an entire evening of storytelling around, don't they? The kind of thing you would never bring up in polite conversation, let alone treat as the centre of a serious scientific discovery. And yet, here we are tonight treating them as something closer to sacred. I want to slow all the way down for a moment because I think we've spent so much time talking about the science of these two substances that we may have skipped past something simpler and honestly a little more strange. What actually is sweat, biologically speaking, other than proof that a body was working, that a heart was pumping hard enough that muscles were straining against something real? What is saliva other than proof that a body was alive, breathing, speaking, tasting the world around it, wetting the mouth before a difficult climb or a careful steady breath through a hollow bone tube? These are not exotic substances. They are the most ordinary byproducts imaginable of simply existing inside a living body for one more day, no different from the sweat gathering on your own skin tonight, or the saliva sitting quietly in your own mouth right now as you listen to me talk. And it turns out, they may also be some of the most durable proof a person can ever leave behind that they existed at all. Here is something that struck me while I was putting tonight's story together, a connection I did not expect to find, and I think it might change how you hear everything else we've already talked about. In 1997, two Australian forensic scientists, Roland van Oorschot and Max Jones, published a short, almost unassuming paper that quietly reshaped modern criminal investigation forever. It ran barely a page or two tucked into a respected scientific journal, the kind of modest publication that rarely makes headlines on its own. Before their work, forensic teams generally needed an actual visible trace of blood, saliva, or some other bodily fluid to build a genetic profile from a crime scene. Fingerprints told you somebody had been there. Genetic evidence back then still needed something wetter, something more obvious left behind. Van Oorschot and Jones proved something far stranger. Simply touching an object, nothing more dramatic than that. No cut, no cough, no obvious fluid at all, leaves behind enough genetic material to identify a person transferred quietly through ordinary skin cells rubbed loose during contact. They called it touch genetic evidence, and within a few short years investigators around the world were swabbing doorknobs, steering wheels and drinking glasses, hunting for exactly the same kind of invisible signature we've spent this entire evening exploring inside a cave in Portugal. Doesn't that stop you for a second? The very same basic principle that finally identified a trace of a real person on a cave wall, 16,000 years old, is used today in police stations and crime laboratories all over the world every single week to solve cases from break-ins to far more serious crimes. We built an entire modern forensic science around a fact that was quietly true the whole time, long before anyone thought to test for it. Every surface you have touched today already carries a little of you on it, whether you meant to leave anything behind or not. There is a complicating wrinkle to this story too, one I think is worth mentioning honestly, because it echoes something we already sat with earlier tonight. Researchers studying this exact phenomenon discovered something they did not expect, a problem they now call secondary transfer. Sometimes a person's genetic material turns up on an object they never personally touched at all, carried there instead by a second person who touched them first, then touched the object afterward, passing along an invisible hitchhiker without either person ever realizing it happened. A handshake, then a doorknob, and suddenly 2 different people's traces sit tangled together on the exact same surface, neither of them aware they had just left evidence of a meeting that, strictly speaking, never even happened at that particular doorknob at all. Sound familiar? That is almost precisely the same honest uncertainty we sat with earlier tonight, wondering whether a particular ancient trace belonged to the actual painter, or to someone else entirely, who simply happened to touch that same spot afterward. It turns out modern forensic science, with all its expensive equipment and rigorous laboratory protocols, still wrestles with the exact same fundamental riddle prehistorians are wrestling with in this cave. A trace tells you with real confidence that contact happened. It is always a little more careful and a little more humble about telling you the full story of exactly whose contact it actually was. Some questions, it turns out, do not get easier just because you point a more expensive machine at them. Now let me take you somewhere even more intimate for a moment, because I think there is one more piece of biology tonight that belongs in this conversation, and it might be the most quietly astonishing one of all. If you have ever carried a pregnancy, even briefly, something remarkable happened inside your own body that had nothing to do with any cave or any ancient discovery or any laboratory in Germany. During pregnancy, a small number of cells belonging to the developing baby slip across the placenta and enter the mother's own bloodstream, travelling quietly through her system, the way any traveller might pass through a new country. Most of those cells eventually fade away, cleared out gently by the mother's own immune system in the weeks and months that follow. But researchers have found that some of them do not. Some settle quietly into the mother's own tissue, her bone marrow, her liver, sometimes even her heart or her brain, and remain there alive, functioning genetically distinct from the rest of her own body for decades afterward, long after that child has grown into an adult with a life entirely their own. Scientists call this microchimerism, borrowing a word originally used for mythical creatures stitched together from more than one animal. and it means that a woman who gave birth 30 years ago may still be carrying a small living population of cells that once belonged to her own child, quietly woven into her own body ever since long outlasting the pregnancy itself, long outlasting most of what anyone would consider ordinary memory. I do not think I need to explain why that detail belongs in tonight's story. We've spent this entire evening marvelling at how a single trace of one person managed to survive physically inside something else across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. And it turns out you do not need 16,000 years or a locked sealed cave or a laboratory full of protective suits to find exactly that kind of quiet miracle. For many of you listening tonight, it might already be happening silently inside your own body right now while you lie there listening to my voice. A small permanent guest you never fully realized you were still hosting. Doesn't that reframe everything else we've talked about tonight at least a little? The ancient trace on this cave wall was never some strange exception to how the world works. It was an unusually well-preserved, unusually dramatic example of something that has actually been happening quietly, constantly, all around us and inside us this entire time. There is one more example I want to leave with you before we wrap up this particular thought, because it comes from an entirely different era, and I think it rounds out the picture nicely. In the Roman city of Pompeii, sealed under volcanic ash, in the year 79, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of pieces of ordinary graffiti scratched into plaster walls by completely ordinary people. Nothing grand or official about any of it. Love notes, insults aimed at a rival, a tally of wine purchased, a boast about a gladiator. One particularly memorable line scratched by somebody clearly proud of their own cleverness simply reads, roughly translated, that the writer was amazed the wall had not yet collapsed under the weight of everyone's nonsense scribbled onto it. None of those people were painters. None of them were leaving behind museum-quality art the way the community in this cave once did. They were simply ordinary Romans bored in love, irritated, mildly drunk, doing exactly what people have always done when handed a blank wall and a sharp object for reasons that felt completely unremarkable to them at the time. And nearly 2,000 years later, we are still reading their jokes, still recognizing their irritation, still finding them against every reasonable expectation entirely embarrassingly human. I think that same impulse connects every single thread of tonight's story honestly, from a red dot pressed onto stone 16,000 years ago, to a joke scratched into plaster in a doomed Roman city, to a doorknob dusted for fingerprints in a police station somewhere tonight. We were never actually trying to build a permanent record when we did any of it. We were simply living ordinarily, and it turns out ordinary living leaves a mark far more often and far more durably than any of us ever stopped to consider. I think we tend to picture ourselves as sealed off separate, complete little islands moving through the world without ever really touching anyone else in any lasting way. We like to imagine our own boundaries as firm, solid, well-defined, this is me, and everything outside this exact edge belongs to somebody else entirely. Tonight's story, and honestly, the actual biology sitting inside your own body right now, suggests something a little different and maybe a little more comforting too, depending on how you choose to look at it. We are far more porous than we usually let ourselves believe. We are constantly leaving small pieces of ourselves behind in the people and places we pass through, and constantly carrying small pieces of other people forward with us, usually without ever knowing it. Usually without it ever showing up on any test we would think to run. A crowded room tonight is not just a group of separate people standing near each other politely. It is on some quiet, invisible, molecular level already a small act of exchange, whether anyone in that room ever intended it to be. Which brings me back one more time to that laboratory in Germany, and to the exact moment a researcher finally confirmed what that small red dot on panel 11 had been quietly holding on to for thousands of years, I keep trying to imagine what that moment actually felt like, and I do not think excitement is really the right word for it, even though excitement was almost certainly part of it too. I think it might have felt nearer to the strange hushed feeling of picking up an old letter and realizing halfway through reading it that the person who wrote it is standing directly behind you, near enough that you could turn around and actually meet them, except you cannot, because 16,000 years sits between you and them, an ocean of time no letter, no trace, no amount of careful science can ever fully cross. And yet somehow something did cross it. Not a name, not a face, not a single word of language, just the plain, quiet, undeniable fact that somebody real once stood exactly where you are picturing them standing, breathing the same cool cave air we described at the very beginning of tonight's story, and left something of themselves behind without ever once imagining that anyone 16,000 years later would still be trying to reach back and find them. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, honestly longer than a single sentence usually allows for. Whoever they were not trying to be remembered by us specifically. They were simply alive on an ordinary day that felt entirely ordinary to them, doing something with their hands that mattered to them for reasons we will never fully know. Maybe their palms were cold, maybe they were tired or hungry, or thinking about something completely unrelated to the painting in front of them, the way any of us might let our mind wander during a long familiar task. And that ordinary day somehow became one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the entire history of this field, not because they planned it that way, but because being alive and touching the world around you was always going to leave some kind of mark, whether anyone ever went looking for it or not. Isn't there something almost gentle about that when you sit with it properly? You do not have to build a monument or write your name somewhere prominent, or do anything particularly remarkable at all to leave something real behind. You just have to have been here, breathing, touching, living the way this one person was on one ordinary day longer ago than most of us can properly hold in our heads at once. Which raises one final enormous question, the one that has been quietly waiting underneath this entire story from the very first moment we stepped into this cave together tonight. If a single accidental trace like this one can rewrite what we thought we knew about art, about identity, about who these people actually were, what happens next? What happens now that we finally know this kind of evidence is even possible to find sitting quietly in places nobody thought to look for it? Waiting for exactly the right combination of curiosity, patience, and careful science to finally come looking. What happens next is already quietly underway, as it turns out in laboratories most of us will never see the inside of, and in caves most of us will never hear the names of. Now that this particular method has proven it can actually work, researchers across this entire field are already turning their attention towards sites they once considered completely out of reach for this kind of question. Not just the famous painted caves of France and Spain we have already spent time with tonight, but shelters and chambers scattered across regions. Archaeology has historically paid far less attention to parts of Africa where some of the very oldest evidence of symbolic human behaviour has already been found in other forms corners of Asia, holding rock art traditions that have barely been studied with modern tools at all remote valleys in South America, where painted handprints have waited patiently on canyon walls for thousands of years without a single research team ever thinking to test them this particular way. For more than a century, the story of ancient art got told almost entirely through a European lens, largely because that is where the most famous, most heavily funded research happened to concentrate, where the universities were oldest, where the museums were richest, where the archaeologists writing the textbooks everyone else studied from happened to reside and work. This new method does not care which continent a cave sits on, does not care which language the nearest village speaks, does not care whether a site has ever appeared in a glossy magazine spread or a school textbook at all. It only cares whether a wall was ever touched by a living person and quietly waited long enough afterward for that touch to survive. Here is a possibility I find almost impossible to stop thinking about. One researchers themselves have started to raise as this field looks toward its own future. If a single cave can preserve traces from several completely different individuals, the way we saw happen right here tonight, what happens when scientists eventually manage to compare those traces against each other directly? Could two separate marks on the same wall, made decades or even generations apart, someday turn out to belong to related people, a parent and a child perhaps, or two siblings, or simply members of the same small, tightly connected community, returning to the exact same sacred space across multiple generations, each one unaware that a distant descendant would one day be able to prove the connection? Picture that for a moment. Not just recovering an anonymous individual from deep history, remarkable as that already is, but potentially reconstructing an actual family thread, stretching invisibly across a cave wall, the way a single vine might climb slowly up the same stretch of stone over many years, one small tendril at a time, decades apart, all part of the same living root system nobody could see from the surface. Imagine a future researcher confirming that the hand that pressed pigment onto one panel and the hand that pressed pigment onto another panel 3 galleries away belonged to two people who shared a grandparent or a great-grandparent connected by blood across a gap of time most of us struggle to even picture properly. Nobody has managed that yet. The genetic material recovered so far remains far too limited, too fragmentary, too incomplete for that level of detail. A handful of samples scattered across dozens of failed attempts, nowhere near the density of data a project like that would eventually require. But the door toward that kind of question, a door that did not even exist a few years ago now, stands open, even if nobody has fully walked through it just yet. I do want to sit with something a little more sobering for a moment too, because I think an honest story owes you the complications along with the wonder. Every single sample removed from a wall like this one is by its very nature a small act of permanent loss. You cannot take a fragment of ancient pigment and mineral crust away from a painting that has survived tens of thousands of years and simply put it back exactly as it was. That patch of wall is gone from the artwork forever, no matter how small the fragment, no matter how carefully chosen, no matter how scientifically justified the decision might have been. Researchers in this field wrestle with that tension, constantly weighing the enormous potential value of a single sample against the simple, uncomfortable fact that these paintings are not a renewable resource. There will never be more Paleolithic cave art created. What survives today is quite literally all that will ever exist, the entire remaining inheritance of an art form that stopped being made longer ago than most of us can properly hold in our heads at once. Think about that responsibility for a moment, the way a museum conservator or a careful archaeologist might carry it home with them at the end of a long day. Every decision about where to sample, how much material to remove, which panel matters enough to justify even the smallest amount of permanent damage has to be made, knowing there is no undo button waiting anywhere in this particular field. A chemist who ruins one attempt at an experiment can simply run it again tomorrow with fresh material. A researcher working on a painting like this one gets exactly one chance on exactly one small patch of stone, and then that particular question is either answered or lost forever, with no second attempt ever possible again. That is not a reason to stop this kind of research, in my own honest opinion, and I do not think most conservators or archaeologists working in this field would tell you it is either. But it is a reason to take the decision seriously, every single time to sample as little as possible from as few locations as possible. Only when the potential knowledge gained feels truly proportional to what gets permanently altered in the process. Good science in a field like this one is not just about what you're technically capable of doing. It is about knowing when restraint matters just as much as ambition does. Would you have made that same trade if the choice had been yours to make a small permanent scar on a priceless painting, in exchange for finally learning something real about the person who made it, or simply once stood beside it? I am honestly not certain there is a single correct answer to that question, and I think that uncertainty is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. There is a broader pattern worth naming too before we wrap up tonight's story properly, because I think it says something true about how discovery actually works, far beyond just this one cave. Think back to where we started this particular thread. Extracting genetic material from a well-preserved bone once felt like the outer edge of what science could possibly achieve, the absolute limit of what anyone reasonably expected to be possible. Then researchers pulled genetic material from ordinary dirt at sites with no bones at all, and that boundary quietly moved further out than anyone had previously believed possible, further than most respected scientists in the field would have publicly bet on only a decade earlier. Then finally a research team dared to test the walls themselves, the very last surface anyone seriously expected to hold anything at all, the one idea that used to get raised only half seriously, and the boundary moved again. I wonder what the next impossible thing turns out to be. I honestly do not know, and I think anyone who tells you they know for certain is guessing more confidently than the evidence actually allows. But if this particular story has taught me anything worth carrying forward, it is that the edge of what we consider possible tends to move exactly once somebody finally gets curious enough and stubborn enough to test an idea everybody else had already quietly decided was not worth trying, sitting through years of failure for the sake of one single sample that finally works. Now, before we dim the lights all the way down on this particular story, I want to take a moment and walk back through everything we have shared together tonight, because I think it deserves one last look, all in a single unbroken line, the way you might look back at a long road just before turning off toward home. We began with an ordinary afternoon in 1963, a quarry blast that accidentally cracked open a doorway into 50,000 years of buried human history. We met the Neanderthals who sheltered in this exact hollow of stone long before any painting ever touched these walls, and we learned how one badly misunderstood arthritis-riddled skeleton shaped an entire century of wrong assumptions about an entire branch of the human family. We watched Homo sapiens arrive in this same valley, pick up ground mineral for the very first time, and begin a painting tradition that would return to these walls across roughly 10,000 years, one generation quietly layered on top of the next. We stood inside a much later chapter too, when farmers and shepherds turned this same sacred hollow into a resting place for more than 100 of their own dead, laid alongside pottery and polished stone tools not far from stone circles, older than anything standing at Stonehenge. We sat with 6 full decades of brilliant, careful scientific effort that could tell us almost everything about this cave, except the one thing everybody actually wanted to know, and then we watched an entirely different branch of science, born from ordinary cave dirt and a stubborn refusal to accept that some questions were simply unanswerable, finally bridge that gap. We stood in our imagination inside the exact laboratory where a small red mark on a panel numbered 11 finally gave up its secret alone, unaccompanied by any trace of animal life pointing toward a real, physical human being who once pressed themselves against this exact patch of stone. We learned that 3 of the 5 confirmed traces recovered from these walls likely belonged to women, a detail that quietly overturned a century of confident assumption, the same way a measuring tape once did in a completely different set of caves, and the same way a Viking grave once did half a world away, in an entirely different chapter of human history. We travelled to a cave that failed to give up its secret precisely because it had been loved and studied too enthusiastically for too long, and to caves on the far side of the planet where completely unconnected people were doing this exact same thing at roughly the same distant moment in time without either group ever knowing the other existed. We even found this exact same story quietly, hiding inside modern police laboratories and inside our own bodies too, in cells that can outlast a pregnancy by decades. Proof that leaving a trace behind was never some strange exception, reserved for ancient painters, but something every single one of us has been doing constantly our entire lives without ever once meaning to. And finally tonight we sat with what all of this actually means underneath the science, underneath the dates and the percentages and the careful laboratory protocols. That sweat and saliva, the most ordinary substances a living body produces without ever thinking about it, might be some of the most durable proof any of us will ever leave that we were here at all. That is the story I wanted to bring you tonight, start to finish exactly as carefully and as honestly as I know how to tell it. A quarry blast, a hidden gallery of horses and bulls, 60 years of brilliant questions nobody could quite answer, and finally a single red dot on a panel numbered 11 that turned out to be holding on to someone real the entire time, patiently, quietly waiting for the right person to finally come looking. I think what I keep coming back to more than any single fact or date or measurement we walk through tonight is how ordinary that person actually was. Not a legend. Not a name carved anywhere for the history books to remember. Just somebody who lived an entire life. We will never know a single detail about who happened on one particular day to press their hand or their breath against a wall that was still standing, still waiting still, quietly keeping their secret, 16,000 years later for you and me to finally sit with together tonight. Thank you sincerely for spending this time with me wherever you're listening from, whatever kind of day led you here tonight, whatever it is you needed to quiet down enough to finally rest. Stories like this one only really work with somebody quiet and patient on the other end of them, someone willing to sit in the dark for a while and let an old, strange, beautiful piece of history settle in properly, rather than rushing past it, and I'm always grateful it turns out to be you. If tonight's journey gave you even a small piece of that same quiet wonder I felt while putting it together, I hope you will let yourself drift off now slowly with the lights low and that gentle hum still filling the room around you. There are more caves waiting out there, more quiet corners of history still holding on to secrets nobody has thought to look for, yet more ordinary people from impossibly distant centuries still waiting patiently to be found by exactly the right kind of curiosity, and I would love nothing more than to go looking for the next one together with you very soon. Until then, sleep well. You have earned it, and so I think has that small red dot on a quiet wall in Portugal finally, after all this time, being truly seen.